The Holy Joseph in the Forest. Once upon a time, there was a mother who had 3 daughters. The eldest was rude and wicked, the second much better though imperfect, but the youngest was a pious, good child. The mother, however, was so peculiar that she favored the eldest daughter the most and could not stand the youngest. Thus she often sent the poor girl into a large forest to get rid of her, thinking she would become lost and never return. However, the guardian angel that every good child has did not abandon her and always brought her back on the right path. One time, though, it seemed as if the guardian angel was absent and the child couldn't find her way out of the forest. She walked until evening fell and then saw a tiny light burning in the distance. She ran towards it and arrived at a small hut. She knocked, the door opened, and she came to a second door where she knocked again. An old man with a snow-white beard, looking venerable, opened it for her, and it was none other than St. Joseph. He said kindly, "Come, dear child, sit by the fire on my little chair and warm yourself. I will fetch you clear water if you are thirsty. But here in the forest, I have nothing for you to eat but a couple of little roots which you must first scrape and cook." St. Joseph gave her the roots. The girl cleaned them, then took a piece of pancake and the bread her mother had given her, mixed everything together in a pan over the fire, and cooked herself a thick soup. When it was ready, St. Joseph said, "I am so hungry. Give me some of your food." The child willingly gave him more than she kept for herself, and God's blessing was with her so that she was satisfied. After they had eaten, St. Joseph said, "Now let's go to bed. I have only one bed. You lie down in it, and I will lie on the straw on the ground." "No," she answered, "you stay in your own bed. The straw is soft enough for me." However, St. Joseph took the child in his arms and carried her to the little bed, where she said her prayers and fell asleep. The next morning, when she woke up, she wanted to say good morning to St. Joseph, but didn't see him. She got up and looked for him, but couldn't find him anywhere. Finally, she noticed a bag of money behind the door, so heavy that she could barely carry it. Written on it was that it was for the child who had slept there that night. She took the bag, bound it away with it, and safely returned to her mother. Because she gave her mother all the money, she couldn't help but be satisfied with her. The next day, the second child also felt a desire to go into the forest. The mother gave her a much larger piece of pancake and bread. It happened to her just as it had with the first child. In the evening, she arrived at the little hut of St. Joseph, who gave her roots for a thick soup. When it was ready, he also said to her, "I am so hungry, give me some of your food." The child replied, "You may have your share." Afterwards, when St. Joseph offered her his bed and wanted to lie on the straw, she replied, "No, lie down in the bed. There is plenty of room for both of us." St. Joseph took her in his arms, put her in the bed, and lay down on the straw. In the morning, when the child woke up and looked for St. Joseph, he had disappeared. But behind the door she found a little sack of money that was about as long as a hand, and on it was written that it was for the child who had slept there last night. So she took the little bag and ran home with it, and brought it to her mother, but she secretly kept a few pieces for herself. Now the eldest daughter had grown curious and wanted to go into the forest the next morning. Her mother gave her pancakes with as much as she wanted, bread, and also cheese. In the evening, she found St. Joseph in his little hut, just as the other two had found him. When the soup was ready and St. Joseph said, "I am so hungry, give me some of your food," the girl answered, "Wait until I am satisfied. Then whatever is left over, you shall have it." She ate, however, nearly the whole of it, and St. Joseph had to scrape the dish. Afterwards, the good old man offered her his bed and wanted to lie on the straw. She accepted without objection, lay down in the little bed, and left the hard straw to the white-haired man. The next morning when she woke up, St. Joseph was not to be found, but she didn't trouble herself about that. She looked behind the door for a money bag. It seemed something was lying on the ground, but as she couldn't quite distinguish what it was, she stooped down and bumped her nose against it. But it remained stuck to her nose, and when she stood up again, to her horror, she saw that it was a second nose hanging firmly onto her own. Then she began to scream and wail, but it was of no use. She was forced to see it hanging there on her nose, stretching out so far. She ran off screaming until she met St. Joseph, at whose feet she fell and begged until, out of pity, he took the nose off her again and even gave her 2 farthings. When she got home, her mother was standing before the door and asked, "What have you received?" Then she lied and replied, "A big bag of money, but I lost it on the way." "Lost it," cried the mother. "Oh, but we will find it again soon," and took her by the hand, wanting to search with her. Initially, she started to cry and didn't want to go, but finally she went. However, on the way, so many lizards and snakes attacked them both that they didn't know how to save themselves. Eventually, they stung the wicked child to death, and they stung the mother in the foot because she had not raised her better. The 12 Apostles. 300 years before the birth of the Lord Christ, there lived a mother who had 12 sons, but was so poor and needy that she no longer knew how she was to keep them alive at all. She prayed daily to God that He might grant that all her sons would be together on earth with the promised Redeemer. As her need became even greater, she sent them out one by one into the world to seek their bread. The eldest was called Peter, who went out and had already gone a long way, a whole day's journey, when he entered a great forest. He searched for a way out, but could find none, and became more and more lost. At the same time, he felt such great hunger that he could barely stay upright. Finally, he became so weak that he had to lie down and believe death to be near. Suddenly, a little boy stood beside him, shining brightly and as beautiful and kind as an angel. The child clapped his little hands together so that Peter had to look up and see him. Then the child said, "Why are you sitting there so troubled?" "Alas," answered Peter, "I am going about the world seeking my bread, so that I may yet see the promised beloved Savior. That is my greatest wish." The child said, "Come with me, and your wish shall be fulfilled." It took poor Peter by the hand and led him between cliffs to a great cave. When they entered, everything shimmered with gold, silver, and crystal, and in the middle there stood 12 cradles side by side. Then the little angel said, "Lie down in the first one and sleep a while. I will rock you." Peter did so, and the angel sang to him and rocked him until he fell asleep. And as he slept, the second brother also came, guided there by his guardian angel, and he was rocked to sleep like the first. And so came the others in turn, until all 12 lay there in the golden cradles and slept. However, they slept for 300 years, until the night in which the Savior of the world was born. Then they awoke and were with him on earth and were called the 12 Apostles. The Rose. There was once a poor woman who had 2 children. The youngest had to go into the forest every day to fetch wood. When she went a long way to search for it, a little child, who was very strong, came to her and helped diligently to gather wood and carried it home. But before a moment had passed, the child disappeared. The child told her mother this, but at first she did not believe it. Finally, she brought a rose home and told her mother that the beautiful child had given her this rose and had told her that when the rose bloomed, he would come again. The mother put the rose in water. One morning, the child could not get out of bed. The mother went to the bed and found the child dead, but it lay quite peacefully. On the same morning, the rose had bloomed. Poverty and humility lead to heaven. Once upon a time, there was a king's son who went out into the field and was thoughtful and sad. He looked at the sky, which was so beautifully pure and blue, and sighed, saying, "How wonderful it must be up there in heaven." He then saw a poor old man coming along the road, approached him and asked, "How can I come to heaven?" The man replied, "Through poverty and humility. Put on my tattered clothes, wander the world for 7 years, and learn its misery. Take no money, but if you hunger, ask compassionate hearts for a bit of bread, and thus you will draw near to heaven." So the king's son took off his magnificent coat and donned the beggar's garb in its place, went out into the wide world, and endured great suffering. He took nothing but a little food, said nothing, but prayed to the Lord that he would one day welcome him into his heaven. When the 7 years were over, he returned to his father's castle, but no one recognized him. He said to the servants, "Go and tell my parents that I have returned." But the servants did not believe him, laughed, and left him standing there. Then he said, "Go and tell my brothers to come down. I would so like to see them again." They also did not want to, until finally one of them went and told the king's children, but they did not believe it and did not concern themselves with it. So he wrote a letter to his mother, describing to her all his misery, but did not say that he was her son. Out of pity, the queen assigned him a place under the stairs and had food brought to him daily by 2 servants. But one was malicious and said, "Why should the beggar have good food?" He kept it for himself or gave it to the dogs, bringing the weak, emaciated beggar only water. However, the other was honest and brought him what was given for him. It was little, but he could live on it for a while. All the while he was quite patient, but he grew weaker and weaker. But as his illness increased, he desired to receive the Holy Sacrament. As it happens during the middle of Mass, all the bells in the town and the surrounding area began to ring on their own. After Mass, the priest went to the poor man under the stairs, where he lay dead, holding a rose in one hand, a lily in the other, and beside him a paper on which his story was written. When he was buried, a rose grew on one side of his grave, a lily on the other. God's food. Once upon a time, there were 2 sisters. One had no children and was rich, while the other was a widow with 5 children, so poor that she no longer had enough bread to satisfy herself and her children. In her distress, she went to her sister and said, "My children suffer the greatest hunger with me. You are rich. Give me a bite of bread." The immensely wealthy sister was as hard-hearted as stone, saying, "I have nothing in my house," and harshly turned the poor woman away with cruel words. Some time later, the husband of the rich sister came home and attempted to cut himself a piece of bread. However, as he made the first cut into the loaf, red blood flowed out. When the woman saw this, she was terrified and told him what had happened. He hurried to assist the widow, but upon entering her room, he found her praying. She held her 2 youngest children in her arms, while the 3 eldest lay there, having passed away. He offered her food, but she replied, "We no longer desire earthly food. God has already satisfied 3 of us, and he will also heed our prayers." Scarcely had she spoken these words when the 2 little ones took their final breath, and shortly thereafter, her heart broke, and she fell dead. The 3 Green Twigs. Once upon a time, a hermit lived in a forest at the foot of a mountain. He spent his time in prayer and good works, and every evening, to honor God, he carried a couple of buckets of water up the mountain. Many animals drank from it, and many plants were refreshed by it, for on the heights, a harsh wind constantly blew, drying out the air and the ground. The wild birds, which shy away from humans, circled high and searched for a drink with their sharp eyes. Because the hermit was so pious, an angel of God, visible to his eyes, went up with him, counted his steps, and when the work was completed, brought him his food, just as the prophet of old was fed by the ravens at God's command. When the hermit had already reached a great age in his piety, it happened that he once saw from afar a poor sinner being taken to the gallows. He carelessly said to himself, "There, that one is getting his deserts." In the evening, when he carried the water up the mountain, the angel who usually accompanied him did not appear, and also did not bring him his food. He was terrified, examined his heart, and tried to think how he could have sinned, since God was so angry, but he did not discover it. He neither ate nor drank, threw himself down on the ground, and prayed day and night. One day, while he was bitterly weeping in the forest, he heard a little bird singing so beautifully and delightfully. This troubled him even more, and he said, "How joyously you sing! The Lord is not angry with you. Oh, if you could only tell me how I have offended him, so that I might do penance, and my heart would be glad again." The bird began to speak and said, "You have done wrong because you condemned a poor sinner who was being led to the gallows. For that, the Lord is angry with you. He alone sits in judgment. However, if you do penance and repent your sins, he will forgive you." Then the angel stood beside him with a dry branch in his hand and said, "You shall carry this dry branch until 3 green twigs sprout from it. At night, when you want to sleep, you shall lay it under your head. You shall beg for your bread from door to door, and not stay longer than 1 night in the same house. This is the penance the Lord lays upon you." The hermit took the piece of wood and went back into the world he had not seen for so long. He ate and drank nothing but what was given to him at the doors. Many requests were not listened to, and many doors remained shut to him, so that he often did not get a crumb of bread for entire days. One day, from morning till evening, he went from door to door, but no one gave him anything, and no one would shelter him for the night. He went out into a forest and eventually found a cave where an old woman was sitting. He said, "Good woman, keep me with you in your house for this night." She replied, "No, I dare not, even if I wished. I have 3 sons who are wicked and wild. If they come home from their robbing expedition and find you, they would kill us both." The hermit said, "Let me stay. They will do no harm to you or me." And the woman, moved by compassion, agreed. The man lay down under the stairs and placed the piece of wood under his head. When the old woman saw this, she asked the reason. He told her that he carried it as penance and used it as a pillow at night. He had offended the Lord because, when he saw a poor sinner being led to the gallows, he said the sinner was getting his deserts. The woman began to weep and cried, "If the Lord punishes us a single word like this, how will it fare with my sons when they appear before him in judgment?" At midnight, the robbers came home, causing a commotion and making a racket. They lit a fire, and when it illuminated the cave and they saw a man lying under the stairs, they became furious and shouted at their mother, "Who is the man? Did we not forbid you from taking anyone in?" The mother replied, "Leave him be. He is a poor sinner doing penance for his guilt." The robbers asked, "What has he done?" "Old man," they called, "tell us your sins." The old man raised himself and told them how he had sinned with a single word, causing God to be angry with him, and how he was now doing penance for this guilt. The robbers were so powerfully touched in their hearts by his story that they were shocked by their own lives, reflected on their actions, and began their penance with heartfelt repentance. The hermit, after converting the 3 sinners, lay down to sleep again under the stairs. In the morning, however, they found him dead, and 3 green twigs had grown high from the dry wood on which his head lay. Thus, the Lord had once more received him into his favor. Our Lady's Little Glass. Once upon a time, a wagoner had driven his cart, heavily laden with wine, so firmly into the ground that he could not free it despite all his efforts. At that moment, Our Lady happened to come by, and when she saw the poor man's distress, she said to him, "I am tired and thirsty. Give me a glass of wine, and I will free your cart for you." "Willingly," answered the wagoner, "but I have no glass in which I can give you the wine." Our Lady then broke off a little white flower with red stripes called field bindweed, which looks very much like a glass, and handed it to the wagoner. He filled it with wine, and Our Lady drank it. In that instant, the cart was freed, and the wagoner could continue on his way. The little flower is still known as Our Lady's Little Glass. The Old Mother. In a large city, there was an old mother who sat alone in her chamber every evening. She reflected on how she had lost her husband first, then both her children, and gradually all her relatives. Finally, even her last friend was gone, leaving her completely alone and abandoned. This made her profoundly sad, and the loss of her 2 sons weighed most heavily on her heart, leading her to accuse God in her grief. She sat still and lost in thought until she suddenly heard the bells ringing for early church. Surprised that she had sorrowfully watched through the entire night, she lit her lamp and went to church. Upon her arrival, the church was already illuminated, but not as usual by candles. Rather, there was a dim light. The church was also filled with people, and all the seats were occupied. When the old mother reached her usual seat, she found it no longer vacant. The entire bench was crowded. Looking at the people, she realized they were all her deceased relatives, sitting there in their old-fashioned clothes, but with pale faces. They neither spoke nor sang, but a soft humming and whispering filled the church. Then an aunt stood up, stepped forward, and spoke to the old mother, saying, "Look there by the altar, and you will see your sons." The old woman looked and saw her 2 children, one hanging on the gallows, the other bound to the wheel. The aunt then said, "See, this is what would have happened to them if they had lived, and if God had not taken them to himself as innocent children." The old mother went home trembling, and on her knees, thanked God for having dealt with her more kindly than she had understood. On the 3rd day, she lay down and died. The Heavenly Wedding. Once upon a time, a poor peasant boy heard the priest in church say, "Whoever wishes to enter the kingdom of heaven must always go straight ahead." So he set out and walked straight ahead over hill and valley without ever turning aside. Eventually, his path led him into a large town and into the midst of a church where a service was being held. Seeing all the splendor, he thought he had finally reached heaven, sat down, and rejoiced with his whole heart. When the service was over, the sexton told him to leave, but he replied, "No, I will not go out again. I am glad to be in heaven at last." The sexton then went to the priest and told him there was a child in the church who would not leave because he believed he was in the kingdom of heaven. The priest said, "If he believes that, we will leave him inside." He then asked the boy if he was inclined to work. "Yes," the little fellow replied, "I am accustomed to work, but I will not leave heaven again." So he stayed in the church, and when he saw how people came and knelt and prayed to the statue of Our Lady with the child Jesus, which was carved out of wood, he thought, "That is the dear God," and said, "Dear God, how thin you are! Surely the people let you starve, but every day I will bring you half of my meal." From then on, he brought half of his meal to the statue each day, and the statue began to enjoy the food. After a few weeks, people noticed that the statue was growing larger, becoming stout and strong, and they wondered greatly. The priest also could not understand it, so he stayed in the church and followed the boy, then saw how the boy shared his food with the Virgin Mary, who accepted it. After some time, the boy fell ill and stayed in bed for 8 days. As soon as he could get up again, the first thing he did was bring his food to the Virgin Mary. The priest followed him and heard him say, "Dear God, do not be angry that I have not brought you anything for so long. I was ill and could not get up." The statue then answered him, "I have seen your goodwill, and that is enough for me. Next Sunday you shall come with me to the wedding." The boy rejoiced at this and told the priest, who asked him to go and inquire if he too might be permitted to go. "No," answered the statue, "you alone." The priest wanted to prepare him first and give him the Holy Communion, and the boy was willing. On the next Sunday, when the host came to him, he fell down and died, and was at the eternal wedding. 10. The Hazel Branch. One afternoon, the Christ child had laid himself in his cradle bed and had fallen asleep. His mother approached him, looked at him full of joy, and said, "Have you laid yourself down to sleep, my child? Sleep peacefully. I will meanwhile go into the forest and fetch a handful of strawberries for you. I know well that you will be delighted when you wake up." Outside in the forest, she found a spot with the most beautiful strawberries, but as she stooped to pick one, an adder leaped up from the grass. She was frightened, left the berry where it was, and hurried away. The adder darted after her, but the Mother of God, as you can imagine, knew what to do. She hid behind a hazel bush and remained there until the adder had crept away again. She then gathered the berries, and as she set out on her way home, she said, "As the hazel bush has been my protection this time, so shall it also be for others in the future." Therefore, since ancient times, a green hazel branch has been the safest protection against adders, snakes, and everything else that creeps on the earth. 6. The Nightingale and the Blindworm. Once upon a time, there lived a nightingale and a blindworm, each with only one eye, who dwelled together in a house for a long time in peace and harmony. One day, the nightingale was invited to a wedding. She said to the blindworm, "I've been invited to a wedding, and I wouldn't like to go with just one eye. Would you be so kind as to lend me yours for the occasion? I'll return it to you tomorrow." Out of kindness, the blindworm agreed. The next day, upon returning home, the nightingale found it so delightful to have two eyes and be able to see on both sides that she refused to return the borrowed eye to the poor blindworm. In response, the blindworm swore to seek revenge on her, her children, and her descendants. "Go ahead," said the nightingale, "and search for me. I'll build my nest in those linden trees, so high, so high, so high. You'll never find it again." Since then, all nightingales have had two eyes, and all blindworms have had none. However, wherever the nightingale builds her nest, a blindworm resides below in the bushes, always striving to crawl up, bore holes into her enemies' eggs, or suck them dry. The Hand with the Knife. A fairy tale by the brothers Grimm. Once there lived a girl who had 3 brothers. The boys meant everything to their mother, and the girl was always put at a disadvantage and treated badly. Every day she had to go out to a barren heath to dig peat, which was used for cooking and heating. A dull old tool was all she had for that nasty work. The little girl had an admirer, an elf who lived in a hill near her mother's house. Whenever she passed by that hill, the elf would stretch his hand out of a boulder and hold out a very sharp knife that had special powers and could cut through anything. She was able to dig out the peat quickly with that knife, go home with the required amount, and when she got to the boulder, she tapped on it twice. The hand would then reach out to take back the knife. When the mother began to notice how quickly and effortlessly the girl brought home the peat, she told the brothers that someone else had to be helping her with the work, otherwise, it wouldn't be possible. The brothers stealthily followed her and saw how she got the magical knife, then caught up with her and forced her to give it to them. They headed back, struck the rock as the girl had done, and when the good elf stretched his hand out, they cut it off with his own knife. The bloody arm pulled back, and because the elf believed that his beloved had betrayed him, he was never seen again. Mr. Fast and Ready. Mr. Fast and Ready had been a soldier for a long time, but since the war had ended and there was nothing to do but the same thing every day, he retired and wanted to become a valet to a great lord. There were clothes with gold trim, plenty to do, and always something new. So he set out on his way and arrived at a foreign court, where he saw a gentleman walking in the garden. Without hesitation, Mr. Fast and Ready approached him briskly and said, "Sir, I am seeking employment with a great lord. If you are His Majesty himself, it would please me most. I can do and know everything required, short and long, as commanded." The gentleman replied, "Very well, my son, that would please me. Tell me, what is it that I desire now?" Without answering, Mr. Fast and Ready turned around, hurried off, and brought a pipe and tobacco. "Very well, my son, you are my servant. But now I charge you with obtaining Princess Nominee for me, the most beautiful in the world. I wish to marry her." "Very well," said Mr. Fast and Ready. "That's no problem. Your Majesty shall soon have her. Just provide me with a carriage drawn by 6 horses, a coachman, guards, runners, footmen, a cook, and a full entourage, and give me princely clothes. Everyone must obey my commands." So they set off. The chief servant sat in the carriage, heading towards the royal court, where the beautiful princess was. When the road ended, they drove into the fields and soon reached a large forest filled with thousands of birds, singing horribly, magnificent in the blue air. "Stop, stop," called Mr. Fast and Ready. "Do not disturb the birds. They praise their creator and wish to serve me once more. Turn left." Thus the coachman had to turn around and drive around the forest. Soon after, they arrived at a large field where 1,000,000,000 ravens were sitting, loudly crying out for food. "Halt! Halt!" cried Mr. Fast and Ready. "Untie one of the led horses, take it into the field, and kill it so the ravens can be fed. They shall not suffer hunger on my account." After the ravens were satisfied, they continued their journey and came to a body of water where a fish was lamenting pitifully, "For God's sake, I have no food in this wretched swamp. Put me in flowing water, and I will serve you in return." Before he finished speaking, Mr. Fast and Ready had called out, "Cook, take him in your apron. Coachman, drive to a flowing water." Mr. Fast and Ready himself got out and placed the fish in the water, where it wagged its tail joyfully. Mr. Fast and Ready said, "Now let the horses run swiftly so that we can arrive at our destination by evening." When they reached the royal residence, he went straight to the best inn. The innkeeper and all his people came out, received him warmly, and thought a foreign king had arrived, though he was only a servant. Nevertheless, Mr. Fast and Ready promptly presented himself at the royal court, endeavored to be agreeable, and sought the hand of the princess. "My son," said the king, "many suitors like yourself have been turned away because none could accomplish the task I set to win my daughter." "Very well," said Mr. Fast and Ready. "Just give me a fair challenge." The king said, "I have sown a quarter of poppy seeds. If you can recover every single one so that not a grain is missing, then you shall have the princess for your lord." "Ho, ho," thought Mr. Fast and Ready. "This is a trifling matter for me. He then took a measure, a sack, and snowy white cloths, went out, and spread the cloths beside the sown field. Before long, the birds that had not been disturbed in their singing in the forest came and picked up the seeds, grain by grain, and deposited them on the white cloths. After they had gathered everything, Mr. Fast and Ready poured it all into the sack, took the measure under his arm, went to the king, and measured out the exact amount of poppy seeds that had been sown. He thought the princess would now be his, but he was mistaken. "Another thing, my son," said the king. "My daughter once lost her golden ring. You must recover it for me before you can have her." Mr. Fast and Ready was unconcerned. "Just show me the water and the bridge where the ring was lost, your majesty, and it shall be retrieved shortly." When he arrived there, he looked down and saw the fish swimming up, the same fish he had released into the river on his journey. It raised its head and said, "Wait a moment. I'll dive down. A whale has the ring under the raft feathers. I'll fetch it." It soon returned and threw it onto the land. Mr. Fast and Ready brought it to the king, who replied, "Now one more thing. In that forest is a unicorn that has caused much harm. If you can kill it, then there will be nothing left to do." Mr. Fast and Ready did not worry much about this either, but went straight into the forest. There were the ravens he had once fed, who said, "Just wait a little longer. Now the unicorn is lying down and sleeping, but not on the ugly side. When it turns around, we'll pick out its good eye. Then it will be blind, and in its rage against the trees, it will run and impale itself on its horn. Then you can easily kill it." Soon, the creature rolled around a few times in its sleep and laid down on the other side. Then the ravens flew down and pecked out its healthy eye. As it felt the pain, it jumped up and ran senselessly through the forest, and soon it had attached itself to a thick oak tree. Mr. Fast and Ready jumped over, cut off its head, and took it to the king. The latter could no longer deny his daughter, who was handed over to Mr. Fast and Ready, who settled with her in the coach in full attire, as he had come, drove to his lord, and brought him the loving princess. He was warmly received, and a grand wedding was held in all splendor. However, Mr. Fast and Ready was appointed prime minister. Everyone in the company where this story was told wanted to be part of the pleasure. One wanted to be a chambermaid, another a wardrobe mistress, while yet another wished to become a chamberlain, and another a chef, etc. The Death and the Goose Herd. There was a poor shepherd on the bank of a large and turbulent water, tending a flock of white geese. Death came to him over the water, and the shepherd asked him where he came from and where he was going. Death replied that he came from the water and wanted to leave the world. The poor goose herder further asked how one could leave the world. Death said that one must cross the water to the new world, which lay beyond. The shepherd said he was tired of this life and begged Death to take him along. Death said it was not yet time and he had other tasks to perform now. Not far from there was a miser who schemed day and night in his bed on how to amass more wealth and property. Death led him to the great water and pushed him in. Because he couldn't swim, he drowned before reaching the shore. His dogs and cats that had followed him also drowned with him. Several days later, Death also came to the goose herder, found him singing joyfully, and said to him, "Are you ready to come now?" He was willing and crossed over with his white geese, which were all transformed into white sheep. The goose herder admired the beautiful land and heard that the shepherds of these places would become kings. As he looked around, he saw the patriarchal shepherds Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob coming toward him, placing a royal crown on his head, and leading him into the shepherd's castle, where he remains to this day. The Puss in Boots. A miller had 3 sons, his mill, a donkey, and a cat. The sons had to grind, the donkey had to fetch grain and carry flour away, and the cat had to catch the mice. When the miller died, the 3 sons divided the inheritance. The oldest received the mill, the second the donkey, and the third the cat. There was nothing left for him. He was sad and said to himself, "I have got the worst of it. My oldest brother can grind, my second can ride on his donkey. What can I do with the cat? Let me have a pair of fur gloves made from his fur. Then it will be over." "Listen," the cat began, who understood everything he had said. "You don't need to kill me to get a pair of poor gloves from my fur. Just have a pair of boots made for me so that I can go out and let myself be seen among people. Then I will soon help you." The miller's son was amazed that the cat spoke like this, but as the shoemaker happened to pass by, he called him in and had him measure a pair of boots. When they were ready, the cat put them on, took a sack, filled the bottom with grain, and attached a string to the top to close it. Then he threw it over his back and walked out the door on two legs like a human. At that time, a king ruled in the country who loved partridges very much. But there was a scarcity of them, and none could be caught. The whole forest was full of them, but they were so shy that no hunter could reach them. The cat knew this and thought to do better. When he came into the forest, he opened the sack, spread the grain around, and laid the string in the grass behind a hedge. There he hid himself, sneaked around, and lay in wait. The partridges soon came running, found the grain, and one by one hopped into the sack. When a good number were inside, the cat pulled the string closed, ran up to them, and wrung their necks. Then he threw the sack over his back and went straight to the king's palace. The guard called out, "Halt, where to?" "To the king," answered the cat curtly. "Are you crazy, a cat to the king?" "Let him go," said another. "The king often has long waits. Maybe the cat will amuse him with his purring and spinning." When the cat came before the king, he bowed and said, "My lord the count," and he mentioned a long and distinguished name, sends his regards to the king, and sends him here partridges that he has just caught in snares. The king was amazed at the beautiful fat partridges, could not contain his joy, and ordered as much gold from the treasury into the cat's sack as he could carry. "Take this to your master and thank him many times for his gift." The poor miller's son sat at home by the window, resting his head on his hand, thinking that he had now given away his last for the cat's boots, and what could he possibly gain from it? Just then, the cat entered, threw the sack from his back, untied it, and poured the gold before the miller. "Here is something for the boots. The king also sends his regards and thanks you very much." The miller was delighted with the wealth, though he could not quite understand how it had happened. As the cat took off his boots, he recounted everything to him, then said, "You now have enough money, but it will not end there. Tomorrow I will put on my boots again, and you shall become even richer. I also told the king that you are a count." The next day, true to his word, the cat went out well booted again to hunt, and brought back a rich catch for the king. This went on every day, and the cat brought home gold every day, becoming as popular as anyone could be with the king, allowed to come and go freely in the castle and roam wherever he pleased. One day, the cat was in the king's kitchen by the hearth warming himself when the coachman came in and cursed, "I wish the king and the princess were off to the gallows. I wanted to go to the inn, have a drink, and play cards, but now I have to take them for a walk by the lake." When the cat heard this, he sneaked home and said to his master, "If you want to become a count and rich, come with me to the lake and bathe there." The miller didn't know what to say to this, but he followed the cat, went with him, stripped naked, and jumped into the water. The cat took his clothes, carried them away, and hid them. Scarcely had he finished when the king drove up. The cat immediately began to lament pitifully, "Oh, most gracious king, my lord has bathed here in the lake. A thief came and stole his clothes that were lying on the shore. Now the Lord Count is in the water and cannot get out, and if he stays in longer, he will catch a cold and die." When the king heard this, he ordered the carriage to stop, and one of his men had to ride back to fetch the king's clothes. The Lord Count put on the finest clothes, and since the king already liked him for the partridges he thought he had received from him, he had to sit beside him in the carriage. The princess was also not displeased, for the count was young and handsome, and she quite liked him. The cat had gone ahead and arrived at a large meadow where over 100 people were making hay. "Whose meadow is this, good people?" asked the cat. "It belongs to the great wizard." "Listen, soon the king will pass by. If he asks to whom the meadow belongs, answer, 'To the count.' And if you do not do this, you will all be slaughtered." With that, the cat continued on and came to a cornfield so vast that no one could overlook it, where more than 200 people were harvesting the corn. "Whose corn is this, good people?" "It belongs to the wizard." Listen, soon the king will pass by. If he asks to whom the corn belongs, answer to the count. And if you do not do this, you will all be slaughtered. Finally, the cat came to a magnificent forest where more than 300 people were cutting down the great oaks and gathering wood. Whose forest is this, good people? It belongs to the wizard. Listen, soon the king will pass by. If he asks to whom the forest belongs, answer, to the count. And if you do not do this, you will all be killed. The cat continued even further, and all the people watched him, afraid of him because he looked so strange and walked in boots like a person. He soon arrived at the wizard's castle, boldly walked in, and stood before him. The wizard looked at him disdainfully and asked what he wanted. The cat bowed and said, I have heard that you can transform yourself into any animal you desire. As for a dog, fox, or even a wolf, I can believe that, but an elephant, that seems entirely impossible to me, and therefore I have come to see for myself. The wizard proudly said, That's child's play for me, and instantly transformed into an elephant. That's impressive, but can you also become a lion? That's nothing, said the wizard, and stood before the cat as a lion. The cat pretended to be frightened and exclaimed, That's incredible and unheard of. I never would have imagined such a thing in my wildest dreams. But even more amazing than anything else would be if you could transform into a tiny creature like a mouse. You surely can do more than any wizard in the world, but that would be beyond belief. The wizard was charmed by the cat's sweet words and said, Oh yes, dear kitten, I can do that too, and hopped around the room as a mouse. The cat chased after him, caught the mouse in a leap, and ate it up. The king, however, had continued his stroll with the count and the princess and arrived at the large meadow. To whom does this hay belong? Asked the king. To the count, everyone shouted as the cat had instructed them. You have a beautiful piece of land here, Count, he said. Then they came to the large cornfield. Whose corn is this, people? It belongs to the count. Ah, Count! Great beautiful estates. Next, they approached the forest. To whom does this wood belong, people? To the count. The king was even more amazed and said, You must be a rich man, Count. I don't believe I have such a magnificent forest. Finally, they arrived at the castle. The cat stood at the top of the stairs, and when the carriage stopped below, he leaped down, opened the door, and said, Your Majesty, you are entering the castle of my master, the Count, who will cherish this honor for his lifetime. The king stepped out and marveled at the magnificent building, which was almost larger and more beautiful than his own castle. The Count then led the princess up the stairs to the hall, which shimmered entirely with gold and gemstones. There, the princess was betrothed to the Count, and when the king passed away, the Count became king, with the Puss in Boots as his first minister. Hanson's Trine. Hanson's Trine was lazy and didn't want to do anything. She said to herself, What should I do? Should I eat, or should I sleep, or should I work? I'll eat first. After she had eaten her fill, she said again, What should I do? Should I work, or should I sleep? I'll take a little nap first. Then she lay down and slept, and when she woke up, it was night, so she couldn't go to work anymore. One afternoon, Hans came home and found Trine lying in the room again, sleeping. He took his knife and cut her skirt off up to her knees. Trine woke up and thought, Now I'll go to work. But when she came out and saw that her skirt was so short, she was startled, became confused whether she really was Trine, and said to herself, Am I or am I not? She didn't know what to answer, stood hesitating for a while, and finally thought, I'll go home and ask if it's me. They will surely know. So she went back, knocked on the window, and called in, Is Hanson's Trine inside? The others answered, thinking it was her. Yes, she's lying in the room sleeping. Well, then it's not me, said Trine cheerfully, walked out of the village and never returned, and Hans was rid of Trine. Of the napkin, the knapsack, the cannon hat, and the horn. There were 3 brothers from Schwarzenfels, very poor at home, who traveled to Spain. There they came upon a mountain completely surrounded by silver. The eldest brother made his pay, took as much as he could carry, and went home with his loot. The other 2 continued their journey and arrived at a mountain where nothing but gold could be seen. One said to the other, How should we do it? And the second took as much gold as he could carry, and went home. But the third wanted to try his luck even better and continued on. After 3 days, he entered a vast forest, tired from walking, plagued by hunger and thirst, and unable to find his way out of the forest. He climbed a tall tree to see if he could find the end of the forest, but all he saw were treetops. He wished only to satisfy his hunger one more time and began to climb down from the tree. When he came down, he saw under the tree a table set with various foods. He was delighted, approached the table, and ate his fill. And when he had finished eating, he took the napkin with him and went on. And when hunger and thirst came upon him again, he opened the napkin, and what he wished for was there. After a day's journey, he came to a charcoal burner who burned charcoal and cooked potatoes. The charcoal burner invited him to dinner, but he said, "I don't want to eat with you, but I want to invite you to dinner." The charcoal burner asked, "How is that possible? I don't see that you have anything with you." "That doesn't matter. Just sit down." And he opened his napkin, and everything that was wished for was there. The charcoal burner enjoyed it and liked the napkin very much, and when they had finished eating, he said, "Trade with me. I'll give you an old soldier's knapsack for the napkin. If you tap it with your hand, a corporal and 6 soldiers with rifles and bayonets come out. They can't help me in the forest, but I'd like the napkin." The exchange took place. The charcoal burner kept the napkin, and the Schwarzenfelser took the knapsack. But as soon as he had gone a short distance, he struck it, and the war heroes came out. "What does my master want?" "You march over there, 174, and fetch my napkin from the charcoal burner I left it with." So they went back and brought him the napkin again. In the evening, he came to another charcoal burner, who invited him to dinner again and had potatoes without fat. The Schwarzenfelser, however, opened his napkin and invited him to dinner. Everything was as desired. When the meal was over, this charcoal burner also asked for the exchange. He gave a hat for the napkin. If you turn it upside down on your head, the cannons go off, as if there were a battery on the spot. When the Schwarzenfelser had gone a distance, he tapped his old knapsack again, and the corporal with 6 men had to fetch him the napkin again. He continued further into the same forest, and in the evening came to the third charcoal burner, who invited him, like the others, to raw potatoes, but received a treat from him and exchanged the napkin for a horn. When blown upon, all cities and villages, as well as all fortifications, fell apart. However, the charcoal burner did not keep the napkin any longer than the others, because the corporal with 6 men soon came and took it away. When the Schwarzenfelser had everything together, he turned back home and wanted to visit his 105 brothers. They were rich from their abundance of gold and silver, and when he arrived wearing an old torn coat, they did not want to recognize him as their brother. Immediately, he struck his knapsack and had 150 men march up. They had to beat up his brothers properly. The whole village came to help, but they accomplished little in the matter. It was reported to the king, who sent a military commando to capture these soldiers. But the Schwarzenfelser struck his knapsack until infantry and cavalry marched up, beating the military commando back to its place. The next day, the king sent out even more people to put the old man in peace. However, he hid his knapsack so long until an entire army emerged, and then he turned his hat a few times, and the cannons went off, and the enemy was beaten and driven away. Peace was then concluded, and he was made viceroy and given the princess as his wife. However, the princess constantly thought that she would have to take such an old man as her husband, and wanted nothing more than to get rid of him again. She, 176, daily investigated the advantages of his power, and he was so faithful that he revealed everything to her. She swiped his knapsack from him and divorced him, and when soldiers marched against him, his people were lost. Yet he still had his little hat. He grabbed it and let the cannons go off. Thus he defeated the enemy and peace was made again. After that, he let himself be deceived again, and the princess swiped his little hat from him. And when the enemy attacked him, he had nothing but his horn. He blew on it, and immediately villages, towns, and all fortifications were destroyed. Then he was king alone and remained so until he died. 43. The Strange Banquet. Once upon a time, a blood sausage and a liver sausage lived together, and the blood sausage invited the liver sausage as a guest. When mealtime came, the liver sausage went happily to the blood sausage's house. However, when she entered the front door, she saw all sorts of strange things. On every step of the staircase, of which there were many, there was always something different. There was a broom and a shovel fighting each other, then a monkey with a large wound on its head, and so on. The liver sausage was completely frightened and dismayed by this, but she gathered her courage, went into the room, and was warmly welcomed by the blood sausage. The liver sausage began to inquire about the strange things outside on the staircase, but the blood sausage acted as if she didn't hear it, or as if it wasn't worth discussing, or she said something like, "It must have been my maid chatting with someone on the staircase," and changed the subject. The blood sausage then said she had to check in the kitchen to make sure everything was properly prepared and nothing was thrown into the ashes. Meanwhile, as the liver sausage walked back and forth in the room, still thinking about the strange things, someone, I don't know who it was, came in and said, "I warn you, liver sausage, you are in a den of blood and murder. Make haste to leave, if you value your life." The liver sausage didn't hesitate long, sneaked out the door, and ran as fast as she could. She didn't stop until she was in the middle of the street outside the house. There she looked back and saw the blood sausage standing up in the attic window with a long, gleaming knife that looked freshly sharpened, threatening and shouting down, "If I had you, I would get you." 54. Hands Dumb. There was once a king who lived happily with his daughter, his only child. Suddenly, the princess gave birth to a child, and no one knew who the father was. The king didn't know what to do for a long time, but eventually he commanded that the princess and the child should go to the church, where a lemon would be given to them. Whoever the lemon touched would be the father of the child and the husband of the princess. This was done, but the command was given that only beautiful people should be allowed into the church. In the town, there was a small, crooked, and hunchback boy who was not very bright and therefore called Hans Dumb. He managed to sneak unseen into the church among the others, and when it came time to distribute the lemon, it was handed to Hans Dumb. The princess was shocked, and the king was so enraged that he ordered the princess, the child, and Hans Dumb to be put into a barrel and set adrift at sea. The barrel soon floated away, and while they were alone at sea, the princess complained and said, "You wretched, hunchbacked, impudent boy, you are to blame for my misfortune. Why did you push your way into the church? The child was none of your concern." "Oh yes," said Hans Dumb, "it did concern me, because I once wished for you to have a child, and what I wish for comes true." "If that's true, then wish for us something to eat here." "I can do that," said Hans Dumb, and he wished for a bowl full of potatoes. The princess would have preferred something better, but because she was so hungry, she helped him eat the potatoes. After they were full, Hans Dumb said, "Now I will wish for us a beautiful ship." And hardly had he said that, they were sitting in a magnificent ship filled with everything one could desire. The helmsman sailed straight to land, and when they disembarked, Hans Dumb said, "Now a castle shall stand there." A magnificent castle appeared, and servants in golden clothes came and led the princess and the child inside. When they were in the middle of the hall, Hans Dumb said, "Now I wish to become a young and clever prince." His hunchback disappeared, and he became handsome, straight, and friendly. The prince liked him, and he became her husband. They lived happily for a long time. Once the old king rode out, got lost, and came to the castle. He was amazed because he had never seen it before, so he decided to stay. The princess recognized her father immediately, but he did not recognize her and thought she had drowned at sea long ago. She entertained him splendidly, and when he wanted to leave, she secretly put a golden cup in his pocket. After he had ridden away, she sent a few riders after him. They stopped him and searched him, finding the golden cup in his pocket. They brought him back. He swore to the princess that he had not stolen it and didn't know how it got into his pocket. Therefore, she said, one must be careful not to immediately accuse someone of guilt, and revealed herself as his daughter. The king was overjoyed. They lived happily together, and after his death, Hans Dumb became king. 59. Prince Swan. There was a girl in the middle of a large forest when a swan approached her. The swan had a ball of yarn and said to her, "I am not a swan, but an enchanted prince. You can release me by unwinding the ball of yarn to which I am bound. But be careful not to break the thread, or I won't reach my kingdom and won't be released. If you unwind the entire ball of yarn, then you will be my bride." The girl took the ball of yarn, and the swan soared into the air while the yarn unwound easily. It unwound all day long, and by evening, the end of the thread was already visible. Unfortunately, it got caught on a thorn bush and broke. The girl was very upset and cried. Night was falling. The wind was blowing loudly in the forest, frightening her, so she began to run as fast as she could. After running for a long time, she saw a little light, rushed towards it, found a house, and knocked on the door. An old woman came out, surprised to see a girl at her door. "Oh, my child, where are you coming from so late?" she asked. "Please give me shelter for the night," said the girl. "I got lost in the forest, and a little bread to eat." "That's a difficult thing," said the old woman. "I would like to give it to you, but my husband is a man-eater. If he finds you, he'll eat you without mercy. But if you stay outside, the wild animals will get you. I'll see if I can help you." So she let her in, gave her a little bread to eat, and then hid her under the bed. The man-eater always came home shortly before midnight, after the sun had completely set, and left in the morning before sunrise. It didn't take long before he came in. "I smell human flesh," he said, searching the room. Finally, he reached under the bed and pulled the girl out. "This is still a good bite." The woman pleaded and begged until he promised to let her live through the night and eat her for breakfast in the morning. However, before sunrise, the old woman woke the girl up. "Hurry up and leave before my husband wakes up. Here, I'll give you a golden spinning wheel to keep as a token of my gratitude. My name is Sun." The girl left and arrived at another house that evening, where everything was as it had been the previous night. The second old woman gave her a golden spindle when she departed and said, "My name is Moon." On the third evening, she arrived at a third house, where the old woman gave her a golden reel and said, "My name is Star." Meanwhile, Prince Swan, though the thread had not yet been completely unwound, had already come so far that he could reach his kingdom. There he became king, married, and lived in great splendor on the glass mountain. That evening, the girl arrived, but a dragon and a lion guarded the entrance. She used the bread and bacon to appease them, and they let her pass up to the castle gate. However, the guards at the castle gate would not let her inside. So she sat down in front of the gate and began to spin on her golden spinning wheel. The queen saw it from above and admired the beautiful wheel. She came down and wanted it for herself. The girl agreed to give it to her if she allowed her to spend one night next to the king's bedroom. The queen agreed, and the girl was brought up. Everything that was said in the room could be heard in the bedroom. When night fell and the king lay in bed, she sang, "Does King Swan still think of his promised bride Julianne? She passed through sun, moon, and star, through lions and through dragons. Does King Swan not wish to awaken?" But the king did not hear, for the cunning queen had feared the maiden and given him a sleeping potion. He slept so deeply that he would not have heard the maiden even if she stood before him. By morning, all seemed lost, and she had to sit by the gate again, spinning with her spindle. The queen also admired the spindle and agreed to take it under the same condition, that she could spend a night next to the king's bedroom. There she sang again, "Does King Swan not think of his promised bride Julianne? She passed through sun, moon, and star, through lions and through dragons. Does King Swan not wish to awaken?" Yet the king slept soundly again from another sleeping potion, and the maiden had also lost her spindle. On the third morning, she sat by the gate with her golden reel and wound it. The queen wanted this treasure too, and promised the girl another night by the bedroom. However, the girl had detected the deception and asked the king's servant to give him something else to drink that evening. Once more, she sang, "Does King Swan not think of his promised bride Julianne? She passed through sun, moon, and star, through lions and through dragons. Does King Swan not wish to awaken?" Then the king awoke. Upon hearing her voice, he recognized her and asked the queen, "When one loses a key and finds it again, does one keep the old one or the newly made one?" The queen replied, "Certainly the old one." Well, then you cannot be my wife any longer, for I have found my first bride again. The next morning, the queen had to return to her father's house, and the king married his true bride, and they lived happily ever after until they died. The Golden Egg. Once upon a time, there were a few poor broom binder boys who also had a little sister to feed, and their lives were difficult and meager. Every day, they had to go into the forest to gather brushwood, and once the brooms were made, their sister would sell them. One day, as they went into the forest, the youngest climbed a birch tree to cut branches, and there he found a nest. Inside sat a dark-colored bird that shimmered through its wings. Since the bird didn't fly away and showed no fear, he lifted its wing and found a golden egg. He took it and climbed down with it. They rejoiced over their find and took it to the goldsmith, who confirmed it was fine gold and gave them a lot of money for it. The next morning, they went into the forest again and found another golden egg, and the bird allowed them to take it patiently, just like the first time. This went on for a while. Every morning they retrieved the golden egg and soon became wealthy. One morning, however, the bird said, "I will lay no more eggs, but take me to the goldsmith. That will be your fortune." The broom-binder boys did as it said and brought it to the goldsmith. When they were alone with him, the bird sang, "Who eats my heart will soon be king. Who eats my liver will find every morning under the pillow a purse of gold." Upon hearing this, the goldsmith called the two boys and said, "Leave me the bird, and I will marry your little sister." The two agreed, and a wedding was celebrated. However, the goldsmith said, "I will eat the bird at my wedding. You two, roast it on a spit, and be careful not to let it spoil. Bring it up when it is cooked." He intended to take out and eat its heart and liver. The two brothers stood by the spit and turned it around. As they did so, and the bird was soon roasted, a piece fell out. "Oh," said one, "I must try that," and ate it. Shortly after, another piece fell out. "That's for me," said the other, and tasted it. Unknown to them, they had eaten its heart and liver, not realizing the fortune it bestowed upon them. Afterwards, when the bird was roasted, they brought it to the wedding table. The goldsmith cut it open and intended to quickly eat the heart and liver, but they were gone. He became angrily furious and shouted, "Who has eaten the heart and liver of the bird?" "We did," they said. "A few pieces fell out while we were turning it, and we took them." "If you have eaten the heart and liver, then you may also keep your sister." And in his anger, he drove them all away. The tailor who became rich soon. Once upon a time, a poor tailor was walking across the fields in winter to visit his brother. Along the way, he found a frozen thrush and said to himself, "What is bigger than a louse? The tailor takes home." So he picked up the thrush and took it with him. When he arrived at his brother's house, he peeked through the window to see if anyone was home. He saw a fat priest sitting with his sister-in-law in front of a table with a roast and a bottle of wine. Just then, there was a knock on the door, and the man wanted to come in. He saw how quickly the woman locked the priest in a chest, put the roast in the oven, and shoved the wine into bed. Now the tailor entered the house and greeted his brother and sister-in-law. He sat down on the chest where the priest was locked. The man said, "Wife, I'm hungry. Is there anything to eat?" "No, I'm sorry, but there's nothing in the house today." But the tailor pulled out his frozen thrush. His brother said, "My, what are you doing with the frozen thrush?" "Oh, it's worth a lot of money. It can tell fortunes." "Well then, let it tell a fortune." The tailor held it to his ear and said, "The thrush says there's a bowl full of roast in the oven." The man went there and found the roast. "What else does the thrush say?" "There's a bottle of wine in bed." He found the wine too. "Oh, I'd like to have that thrush. Sell it to me." "You can have it if you give me the chest I'm sitting on." The man agreed immediately, but the woman said, "That won't work. I'm too fond of the chest. I won't give it away." But the man said, "Don't be so silly. What good is such an old chest to you?" And he gave the chest to his brother in exchange for the bird. The tailor placed the chest on a wheelbarrow and carted it away. Along the way, he kept saying to himself, "I'll take the chest and throw it into the water. I'll take the chest and throw it into the water." Eventually, the priest inside stirred and said, "You know what's inside the chest. Let me out and I'll give you 50 thalers." "Yes, I'll do that." He let him out and went home with the money. People wondered where he got so much money from, but he said, "I'll tell you, hides are in high demand, so I slaughtered my old cow and got so much for the hide." The people in the village wanted to profit too. They came and slaughtered all their oxen, cows, and sheep, cutting their necks and taking the hides to the city. But they received very little money for them because so many were offered at once. The farmers were upset about the loss and threw dirt and other rubbish at the tailor's door. However, he collected everything in his chest, took it to the city to an inn, and asked the innkeeper if he could keep the chest containing valuable treasures for a while, as they weren't safe with him. The innkeeper gladly agreed and took the chest. Some time later, the tailor returned, asked for it back, and opened it to see if everything was still there. But it was full of dirt, so he became furious, insulted the innkeeper, and threatened to sue him. Afraid of the scandal and concerned for his reputation, the innkeeper gladly gave him 100 thalers. The farmers were upset again that everything they did to harm the tailor turned into profit for him. They took the chest, forcibly stuffed him inside, set it on the water, and let it float away. The tailor remained quiet for a while until he had floated around a corner. Then he shouted loudly, "No, I won't do it. I won't do it, even if the whole world wanted it." A shepherd heard the shouting and asked, "What won't you do?" "Well," said the tailor, "there's a king who has this foolish notion that whoever floats down the river in this chest must marry his only beautiful daughter. But I've already made up my mind. I won't do it, even if the whole world wanted it." "Wait a minute. Couldn't someone else sit in the chest and marry the princess?" "Oh, yes, that could work." "Then I'll take your place." So the tailor got out, the shepherd got in, the tailor closed the chest again, and the shepherd soon sank. The tailor then took the entire flock of the shepherd and drove them home. The farmers were amazed at how he returned and even had so many sheep. The tailor said, "I sank deep, deep. There at the bottom, I found the entire flock and brought them out." The farmers wanted to get sheep too and went out together to the water. That day, the sky was completely blue with small white clouds, and they exclaimed, "We already see the lambs at the bottom." The mayor said, "I'll go down first, take a look, and if it's good, I'll call you." As he plunged in, the water splashed. Plump! They thought he was calling them, "Come," and all jumped in after him. Thus, the entire village belonged to the tailor. 63. Bluebeard. In a forest lived a man who had 3 sons and a beautiful daughter. One day, a golden carriage with 6 horses and many servants arrived, stopped in front of their house, and a king stepped out. He asked the man to give him his daughter in marriage. The man was delighted that such fortune had befallen his daughter and immediately agreed. There was nothing wrong with the suitor except that he had a completely blue beard, which gave people a small shock whenever they looked at him. The girl was initially frightened and hesitant to marry him, but on her father's urging, she finally agreed. However, because she felt such anxiety, she went to her 3 brothers alone and said, "Dear brothers, if you hear me scream wherever you are, drop everything and come to my aid." Her brothers promised this and kissed her, saying, "Farewell, dear sister. When we hear your voice, we will jump on our horses and come to you." Then she got into the carriage with Bluebeard and rode away with him. When they arrived at his castle, everything was magnificent, and whatever the queen wished for, it happened. They would have been very happy if she could have gotten used to the king's blue beard, but every time she saw it, she was inwardly frightened. After some time had passed, he said, "I must go on a great journey. Here are the keys to the entire castle. You can unlock and explore everything, except for the chamber to which this small golden key belongs. I forbid you to open that one, or your life will be forfeit." She took the keys, promised to obey him, and when he left, she unlocked the doors one by one and saw so many riches and splendors that she thought they must have been gathered from the entire world. Nothing remained but the forbidden chamber, and the key was made of gold. She thought to herself, perhaps the most precious things are locked in there. Curiosity began to torment her, and she would have preferred not to have seen everything else if only she had known what was inside that chamber. For a while, she resisted the desire, but eventually it became so powerful that she took the key and went to the chamber. Who will know that I opened it? She said to herself. I will just take a quick look inside. She unlocked the door, and as it opened, a stream of blood flowed towards her, and she saw dead women hanging on the walls. Some were reduced to skeletons. She was so frightened that she quickly slammed the door shut, but in her panic, the key slipped from her hand and fell into the blood. She hurriedly picked it up and tried to wipe away the blood, but it was in vain. Every time she wiped it off one side, it reappeared on the other. She spent the entire day rubbing and trying everything possible, but nothing worked to remove the bloodstains. Finally, in the evening, she put it in the hay, hoping it would draw out the blood overnight. The next day, Bluebeard returned, and the first thing he asked for were the keys. Her heart pounded as she brought him the others, hoping he wouldn't notice the missing golden key. But he counted them all, and when he finished, he said, "Where is the key to the secret chamber?" as he looked into her face. She blushed deeply and replied, "It's upstairs. I misplaced it. Tomorrow I will look for it." "Better go now, dear wife. I will need him today," said Bluebeard sternly. "Oh, I must tell you, I lost it in the hay. I have to search for it," she replied nervously. "You haven't lost it," said Bluebeard angrily. "You put it there to try and wash out the bloodstains, because you disobeyed my command and entered the chamber. But now you shall go in, whether you want to or not." She had to fetch the key, which was still covered in bloodstains. "Prepare yourself for death. You shall die today," said Bluebeard, taking out his large knife and leading her to the staircase. "Let me say my prayers before I die," she pleaded. "Very well, but hurry. I do not have time to wait." She ran up the stairs and cried out as loudly as she could from the window, "Brothers, my dear brothers, come help me." The brothers were sitting in the forest enjoying cool wine, when the youngest said, "I think I heard our sister's voice. Quick, we must go to her aid." They jumped on their horses and rode as if carried by the wind. Meanwhile, their sister knelt in fear. From below, Bluebeard called out, "Are you ready yet?" She heard him sharpening his knife on the bottom step. She looked out but could only see a distant cloud of dust, as if a herd of cattle was approaching. She screamed again, "Brothers, my dear brothers, come help me." Her fear grew stronger. Bluebeard shouted, "If you don't come soon, I'll come and get you. My knife is ready." She looked out again and saw her three brothers riding across the field, approaching like birds in flight. In her utmost distress, she screamed for the third time, "Brothers, my dear brothers, come help me." The youngest brother was so close that she could hear his voice reassuring her, "Hold on, dear sister, just a moment longer and we'll be with you." Bluebeard shouted, "Enough praying. I won't wait any longer. If you don't come, I'll come get you." "Oh, just let me pray for my three dear brothers," she begged desperately. But he did not listen. He ascended the stairs and grabbed her by the hair, ready to stab her in the heart with his knife. Just then, her three brothers pounded on the door, burst in, and wrested her from his grasp. They drew their sabers and struck him down. Bluebeard was then hung in the chamber of blood among the other women he had killed. The brothers took their beloved sister home, and all the riches of Bluebeard belonged to her. 64. The Story of the Simpleton. I, the White Dove. In front of a king's palace stood a magnificent pear tree that bore the most beautiful fruits every year. However, when they ripened, they would all disappear overnight, and no one knew who was taking them. The king had 3 sons, and the youngest was considered simple-minded and called the simpleton. The king commanded his eldest son to watch under the pear tree every night for a year to catch the thief. The eldest son did so and kept watch every night. The tree bloomed and became laden with fruits. As they began to ripen, he remained diligent. However, on the last night, sleep overcame him, and he fell asleep. When he woke up, all the fruits were gone, leaving only the leaves. The king then commanded his second son to watch for a year, but he fared no better than his brother. On the last night, he could not resist sleep, and by morning all the pears had been taken. Finally, the king ordered the simpleton to watch for a year, much to the amusement of those at the king's court. The simpleton stayed vigilant, and on the last night, he fought off sleep. He saw a white dove flying in, picking off one pear after another, and carrying them away. As the dove flew off with the last pear, The simpleton got up and followed it. The dove flew to a high mountain and disappeared into a crevice in a rock. The simpleton looked around and saw a small gray man standing beside him. He said to the man, "God bless you." The man replied, "God has blessed me in this moment through your words, for they have freed me. Enter into the rock. There you will find your fortune." The simpleton entered the rock, descending many steps. At the bottom, he found the white dove entangled in cobwebs. As soon as the dove saw him, it broke through the webs. When it tore the last thread, a beautiful princess stood before him. He had freed her, and she became his wife. He became a rich king and ruled his land with wisdom. A sick, the bee queen. Two princes set out on adventures and ended up living wild, rough lives, never returning home. The youngest, known as the simpleton, went out in search of his brothers. When he found them, they mocked him for thinking he could navigate the world with his simplicity, while they, who were much wiser, couldn't manage it themselves. They continued their journey together and came upon an anthill. The two elder brothers wanted to disturb it to see the little ants scurry about in fear and carry away their eggs. However, the simpleton said, "Let the creatures be in peace. I cannot bear to see you disturb them." They moved on and arrived at a lake where many ducks were swimming. The two brothers wanted to catch a couple to roast, but again the simpleton said, "Let the creatures be in peace. I cannot bear to see you kill them." Finally, they came upon a beehive dripping with so much honey that it was running down the trunk of the tree. The two brothers wanted to build a fire under the tree to suffocate the bees and take away the honey. But the simpleton restrained them again, saying, "Let the creatures be in peace. I cannot bear to see you burn them." The three brothers then came to a castle where all the stables were filled with stone horses, and there was no one to be seen. They walked through all the halls until they reached a door at the very end with 3 locks on it. In the middle of the door was a small latch through which one could see into the room. Inside, they saw a gray little man sitting at a table. They called out to him once, twice, but he did not hear them. Finally, they called out a third time, and he stood up and came out. He didn't speak a word, but took them by the hand and led them to a table laden with rich food. After they had eaten, he led each of them to a separate sleeping chamber. The next morning, he went to the eldest prince, beckoned him, and took him to a stone table where the 3 tasks to release the castle were written. The first task was to find the 1,000 pearls of the king's daughter hidden under the moss in the forest. They had to be found before sunset, or the one who attempted it would turn to stone. The prince searched all day, but by the end of the day, he had only found 100 pearls and was turned into stone. The next day, the second brother undertook the adventure, but met the same fate as the eldest, turning to stone because he found only 200 pearls. Finally, it was the simpleton's turn. He searched in the moss, but it was so difficult to find the pearls that he sat down on a stone and wept. As he sat there, the ant king, whom he had once saved with 5,000 ants, arrived. It didn't take long for them to find the pearls together and pile them up. The second task was to retrieve the key to the princess's sleeping chamber from the lake. When the simpleton arrived at the lake, the ducks he had once saved swam up, dove under the water, and retrieved the key from the depths. The third task, however, was the most difficult. He had to identify the youngest and dearest of the king's 3 sleeping daughters. They looked identical and differed only in that the eldest had eaten a piece of sugar, the second had syrup, and the youngest had eaten a spoonful of honey. The only way to tell was by their breath. Then the bee queen, whose bees the simpleton had protected from the fire, arrived. She tested the breath of all 3 sisters, finally settling on the one who had eaten honey. Thus, the prince identified the correct princess, breaking the spell. All were released from their enchantment, and those turned to stone regained their human form. The simpleton married the youngest and dearest princess and became king after her father's death. His 2 brothers married the other 2 sisters. A third, the 3 feathers. Once upon a time, there was a king who sent his 3 sons out into the world, promising that whoever brought back the finest linen yarn would inherit the kingdom after his death. To guide them on their journey, he stood in front of his castle and blew 3 feathers into the air, instructing each son to follow the flight of a feather. One feather flew westward, which the eldest son followed. Another flew eastward, followed by the second son. The third feather, however, fell onto a stone not far from the palace. The youngest prince, known as the simpleton, had to stay behind while his brothers mocked him, telling him he should search for linen yarn near the stone. Heartbroken, the simpleton sat on the stone and wept. As he moved back and forth, the stone shifted, revealing a marble slab with a ring underneath. The simpleton lifted the slab and found a staircase leading down into an underground vault. There, he found a maiden spinning flax. She asked him why he looked so sorrowful, and he told her of his plight, to find the finest linen yarn and yet not be able to leave. The maiden then unraveled her own yarn, the finest linen yarn, and instructed him to take it back to his father. When he returned, much time had passed, and his brothers had just returned, confident they had brought the finest yarn. But when each presented his yarn, the simpleton's was finer still, and the kingdom would have been his. Unsatisfied, the two brothers demanded another condition from their father. The king then asked for the most beautiful carpet, blowing the three feathers into the air once more. Again, the third feather fell on the same stone, and the simpleton was unable to go further, while his brothers went east and west. The simpleton lifted the stone again and went back down, finding the maiden weaving a magnificent carpet in the brightest colors. When it was finished, she told him, "This is woven for you. Carry it to your father, and no one else in the world will have one so splendid." He took it to his father, surpassing his brothers once more, who had brought the most beautiful carpets from all lands. Yet they persuaded the king to make another condition. Whoever wanted to inherit the kingdom must bring home the most beautiful woman. The feathers were blown into the air again, and the simpleton's feather remained on the stone. He went down and lamented to the maiden about the new difficult task his father had set for him. The maiden assured him she would help. He only needed to continue further into the vault, where he would find the most beautiful woman in the world. The simpleton followed her advice and entered a chamber glittering with gold and precious stones. Instead of finding a beautiful woman, he found a hideous frog sitting there. The frog called out to him, "Embrace me and sink yourself." Reluctantly, the simpleton did so after the frog repeated its call twice more. He carried the frog to a pond and jumped in with it. As soon as the water touched them, the frog transformed into the most beautiful maiden he had ever seen. They emerged from the water, and he presented her to his father, where she appeared 1,000 times more beautiful than the wives brought by the other princes. The kingdom would have been the simpleton's again, but his brothers protested once more, demanding another challenge. They agreed that the prince whose wife could jump up to a ring hanging in the middle of the hall would have the advantage. The eldest prince's wife could barely reach halfway up, and the second prince's wife jumped a bit higher. However, the simpleton's wife jumped all the way to the ring. Finally, they had to admit that after their father's death, the simpleton should inherit the kingdom. When the king died, he became king and ruled wisely for a long time. 4. The Golden Goose. Once there was a man who had 3 sons, and the youngest was a simpleton. One day, the eldest said, "Father, I want to go into the forest to chop wood." "Don't do that," replied the father, "or you'll come home with a wounded arm." But the son paid no heed, thinking he could take care of himself. He put a cake in his pocket and went out. In the forest, he encountered a gray old man who said, "Give me a piece of the cake you have in your pocket. I'm so hungry." The clever son replied, "Why should I give you my cake? Then I'll have nothing for myself. Go away." He then walked away with his axe and began to chop a tree. Before long, however, he missed his mark. The axe struck his arm, and he had to go home and have it bandaged. This misfortune had been caused by the old gray man. Next, the second son went into the forest, where the old man also asked him for a piece of cake. He too refused, and in return he struck his own leg with the axe, forcing him to be carried home. Finally, the simpleton went out, and the old man asked him for a piece of cake just like he had asked the others. "Here you go," said the simpleton, handing it over. The old man said, "Chop down this tree, and you will find something." The simpleton began chopping. and when the tree fell, there was a golden goose underneath. He took it with him and went to an inn where he intended to spend the night. He did not stay in the common room, but asked for a private one and placed his goose in the middle. The innkeeper's daughters saw the goose and became curious. They very much wanted a feather from it. The eldest said, "I'll go up, and if I don't come back soon, follow me." She went to the goose, but as soon as she touched a feather, she got stuck. Unable to get down, the second daughter went up and couldn't resist pulling a feather either. The eldest warned her against it, but it was no use. She too got stuck. The third daughter, after waiting below for a long time, finally went up. Despite the warnings from the others not to go near the goose, she thought she must have a feather and got stuck as well. The next morning, the goose in his arms and then left with the three girls stuck to it following him. On the field, they met the pastor. "Shame on you naughty girls, why are you openly following that young lad?" he scolded, grabbing one by the hand to pull her back. But as soon as he touched her, he got stuck too and had to run after them. Soon after, the sexton came along. "Hey, Reverend, where are you off to so fast? We have a christening today." He rushed towards him, grabbed his sleeve, but got stuck as well. As the five of them marched one after the other, two farmers with their hoes came from the field. The pastor shouted to them to free them, but as soon as they touched the sexton, they got stuck too. Now there were 7 of them trailing behind the simpleton with the goose. He then arrived in a city where a king ruled, and this king had a daughter who was so serious that no one could make her laugh. The king had declared that whoever could make her laugh would marry her. When the simpleton heard this, he went before the king's daughter with his goose and its entourage. As soon as she saw the procession, she burst into loud laughter and could not stop. He then asked for her hand in marriage, but the king made various objections and said he must first bring him a man who could drink a cellar full of wine. So he went into the forest, and where he had cut down the tree, he saw a man sitting there with a very sad face. The simpleton asked him why he looked so troubled. "Oh, I am so thirsty and can't get enough to drink. I emptied a barrel of wine, but what is a drop on a hot stone?" he replied. "I can help you with that," said the simpleton. "Come with me, and you shall have your fill." He led him into the king's cellar, where the man set to work on the large barrels, drinking and drinking until his hips hurt. Before a day had passed, he had drunk the entire cellar dry. The simpleton now demanded his bride, but the king was upset that a poor fellow everyone called a simpleton would take away his daughter. He made new conditions. He must first find a man who could eat a mountain of bread. The simpleton returned to the forest, where he found a man sitting in the place of the tree. This man was tightening his waist with a belt, looking quite miserable. "I have eaten a whole oven full of breadcrumbs, but what good is it with my great hunger? I still feel nothing in my stomach and must tighten my belt, or else I'll starve," he lamented. Hearing this, the simpleton was delighted and said, "Come with me, and you shall eat your fill." He brought him to the king, who had gathered flour from the entire kingdom and baked an enormous mountain of bread. The man from the forest stood before it, and in a day and a night devoured the entire mountain. The simpleton again asked for his bride, but the king sought another excuse and demanded a ship that could sail on land and water. If he could accomplish this, he would immediately receive the princess. The simpleton went back into the forest once more, where he found the old gray man to whom he had given his cake. "I have drunk and eaten for you, and now I will give you the ship, because you have been merciful to me," said the old man. He then gave him the ship that could sail on land and water. When the king saw this, he had no choice but to give him his daughter. The wedding was celebrated, and he inherited the kingdom, living happily with his wife for a long time. Hurlaburlabutz. A king got lost while hunting, and a little white man stepped forward to him. "Lord King, if you will give me your youngest daughter, I will lead you out of the forest." The king, in his fear, agreed to this. The little man led him back onto the path, then bid farewell and called out, "In 8 days I will come to fetch my bride." However, back home, the king was saddened by his promise, for he loved his youngest daughter the most. The princesses noticed this and wanted to know what troubled him. Finally, He confessed that he had promised the youngest to a little white forest man who would come in 8 days to take her away. They told him to take heart. They would handle the situation. When the day arrived, they dressed a cowherd's daughter in their clothes, placed her in their room, and instructed her, "If someone comes to fetch you, go with them." Then they all left the house. Hardly were they gone when a fox entered the castle and said to the girl, "Sit on my rough tail, hurlburlbutts, out into the forest." The girl sat on the fox's tail, and so he carried her out into the forest. But when they arrived at a beautiful green clearing, where the sun shone brightly and warmly, the fox said, "Dismount and groom me." The girl obeyed. The fox laid its head on her lap, and as she groomed him, she said, "Yesterday at this time, it was much nicer in the forest." "How did you come to be in the forest?" asked the fox. "Oh, I used to herd cows there with my father." "So you are not the princess? Sit on my rough tail, hurlaburlabutts. Back to the castle." So the fox carried her back and said to the king, "You have deceived me. This is a coward's daughter. In 8 days I will come again, and if you do not give me your daughter, then you will suffer." The king was afraid, and when the fox returned, the princesses dressed a gooseherd's daughter in magnificent clothes, sat her down, and left. The fox returned and said, "Sit on my rough tail, hurlaburlabutts, out into the forest." When they reached a sunny spot in the forest, the fox again said, "Dismount and groom me." As the girl groomed the fox, she sighed and said, "Where might my geese be now?" "What do you know about geese?" "Oh, I used to drive them to the meadows every day with my father." "So you are not the king's daughter. Sit on my rough tail, hurlaburlabutts, back to the castle." The fox took her back and said to the king, "You have deceived me again. This is a gooseherd's daughter. In 8 days I will come once more, and if you do not give me your daughter, then there will be consequences." The king was afraid, and when the fox returned, he gave him the princess. "Sit on my rough tail, hurlaburlabutts, out into the forest." She had to ride on the fox's tail, and when they reached the sunny clearing, he also said to her, "Dismount and groom me." But when he laid his head on her lap, the princess began to cry and said, "I am a king's daughter, and here I am supposed to groom a fox. If only I were sitting at home in my chamber, I could see my flowers in the garden." Hearing this, the fox knew he had found the right bride. He transformed into the little white man, who was now her husband. She had to live with him in a small hut, cooking and sewing, and it lasted for a good while. But the little man did everything for her sake. Once the little man said to her, "I must go away, but soon 3 white doves will come flying. They will skim very low over the earth. Catch the middle one, and as soon as you have it, cut off its head. But beware, do not catch any other except the middle one, or a great misfortune will arise from it." The little man departed. It wasn't long before 3 white doves came flying along. The princess kept watch, caught the middle one, took a knife, and cut off its head. Scarcely had it fallen to the ground when a handsome young prince stood before her and said, "A fairy enchanted me. For 7 years I was to lose my form, and then fly past my wife as a dove between 2 others. She must catch me and cut off my head, and if she catches the wrong one or fails to catch me while flying past once, then all hope is lost and no redemption is possible. That's why I asked you to be very careful, for I am the little gray man, and you are my wife." The princess was delighted, and they went together to her father. When he died, they inherited the kingdom. From the Summer and Winter Garden. A merchant wanted to go to the fair, so he asked his 3 daughters what he should bring them. The oldest said, "A beautiful dress." The second, "A pair of pretty shoes." The third, "A rose." But obtaining the rose was difficult because it was in the middle of winter. However, because the youngest was the most beautiful and had such a great love for flowers, the father said he would see if he could get it and make a real effort for her. When the merchant was returning, he had a splendid dress for the eldest and a pair of beautiful shoes for the second, but he had not been able to get the rose for the third. When he had gone into a garden and asked for roses, people had laughed at him, saying, "Does he think roses grow in the snow?" He was very sorry about this, and as he pondered whether he could bring nothing at all for his dearest child, he came to a castle with a garden beside it, where it was half summer and half winter. On one side, the most beautiful flowers, large and small, were blooming, and on the other, everything was bare with deep snow. The man got off his horse, and when he saw a whole hedge full of roses on the summer side, he was happy, went over and broke one off. Then he rode away again. He had already ridden a good way when he heard something running and panting behind him. He turned around and saw a large black beast that called out, "Give me back my rose, or I'll kill you. Give me back my rose, or I'll kill you." The man said, "I beg you, let me keep the rose. I am supposed to bring it to my daughter, who is the most beautiful in the world." "Fine by me, but give me the beautiful daughter in return for a wife?" To get rid of the beast, the man said yes, thinking they would not actually come and demand her. But the beast called after him, "In 8 days I will come and take my bride." The merchant now brought each daughter what she had wished for. They were all pleased, but the youngest most of all with the rose. After 8 days, the three sisters were sitting together at the table when something heavy-footed came up the stairs and to the door, calling out, "Open up! Open up!" They opened the door, but were quite frightened when a large black beast entered. "Since my bride did not come and the time is up, I will come and fetch her myself." With that, it approached the youngest daughter and grabbed her. She began to scream, but it was of no use. She had to go with it. When the father returned home, his dearest child had been abducted. The black beast carried the beautiful maiden to its castle, which was wondrous and beautiful, with musicians playing inside. Below was the garden, half summer and half winter, and the beast did everything out of love for her that it could see in her eyes. They ate together, and she had to serve it or it wouldn't eat. She grew fond of the beast, and eventually she loved it dearly. One day she said to it, "I feel so anxious. I don't know why, but it feels like my father is ill, or one of my sisters. If only I could see them just once." The beast led her to a mirror and said, "Look inside." When she looked in, it was as if she were at home. She saw her room and her father, who was indeed ill from sorrow, blaming himself because his dearest child had been abducted by a wild beast and presumably eaten by it. If he had known how well she was, he wouldn't have been so sad. She also saw her two sisters sitting by his bed, weeping. All of this weighed heavily on her heart, and she begged the beast to let her go home for a few days. The beast resisted for a long time, but finally, moved by her distress, it took pity on her and said, "Go to your father, but promise me that you will return in 8 days." She promised, and as she left, it called after her, "But do not stay away longer than 8 days." When she returned, her father was overjoyed to see her again, but the illness and sorrow had already eaten away at his heart, and he could not recover. After a few days, he died. She could think of nothing but her sadness, and afterward her father was buried. She attended the funeral, and then she and her sisters wept together and comforted each other. Finally, when she thought of her beloved beast again, the 8 days had long passed. She was very afraid, and it seemed to her that something was wrong. She quickly set out and returned to its castle. But when she arrived again, it was quiet and somber inside. The musicians were not playing, and everything was draped in black mourning. The garden was entirely winter, covered in snow. And when she searched for the beast itself, it was gone. She searched everywhere, but could not find it. She was doubly sad and did not know how to console herself. Once, as she wandered sadly in the garden and saw a pile of cabbage heads that were old and decaying on top, she moved them around. When she turned a couple over, she saw her beloved beast lying underneath, dead. Quickly, she fetched water and poured it over the beast without stopping. Suddenly, it jumped up and was transformed into a handsome prince. They celebrated their wedding, the musicians played once more, the summer side of the garden flourished splendidly, the black mourning was taken down, and they lived happily together forever after. The Okerlo. A queen placed her child in a golden cradle and set it adrift on the sea. Instead of sinking, it swam to an island inhabited by cannibals. As fate would have it, the cannibal's wife found the cradle at the shore and, upon seeing the beautiful baby girl inside, decided to raise her for her son, intending her as his future wife. She struggled to keep the child hidden from her husband, the old Okerlo, knowing he would devour it if he saw it. When the girl grew up, She was supposed to marry the young Okerlo, but she didn't like him at all and cried all day. One day, while sitting by the shore, a handsome young prince swam by, and they fell in love. However, they were discovered by the old cannibal's wife, who angrily seized the prince, declaring he would be roasted for her son's wedding. That night, the young prince, the girl, and Okerlo's 3 children all slept in the same room. When night fell, old Okerlo, craving human flesh, demanded the prince immediately. Hearing this through the wall, the girl quickly got up, took the golden crown from one of Okerlo's children, and placed it on the prince's head. When the cannibal's wife arrived in the dark, feeling the heads, she took the one without the crown and promptly devoured it. The girl became frightened, fearing everything would be exposed at dawn, so she secretly fetched a boot that covered a mile, a divining rod, and a cake with a bean that provided answers. With the prince, they set off wearing the mile-high boot, traveling a mile with each step. They occasionally asked the bean, "Bean, are you there?" "Yes," replied the bean. "I'm here, but hurry, because the old cannibal's wife is coming with the other mile-high boot left behind." The girl then used the divining rod to transform into a swan, and the prince into a pond, where the swan swam. The cannibal's wife tried in vain to lure the swan to shore and returned home in frustration. The girl and the prince continued on their journey. "Bean, are you there?" "Yes," said the bean. "I'm here, but the old woman is coming again." The cannibal told her why she was deceived. The girl then took the rod and transformed herself and the prince into a dust cloud, making it impossible for Mrs. Okerlo to penetrate. Frustrated, she turned back empty-handed, and the two continued on their journey. "Bean, are you there?" "Yes, I'm here, but I see Mrs. Okerlo coming again, taking giant strides." For the 3rd time, the girl took the divining rod and transformed herself into a rose bush and the prince into a bee. When the old cannibal arrived, she did not recognize them in this form and went back home. However, now they couldn't regain their human form because the girl had thrown the magic rod too far in her panic. They had walked so far that the rose bush stood in a garden belonging to the girl's mother. The bee sat on the rose, stinging anyone who tried to pick it. Once, the queen herself went into her garden and saw the beautiful flower, but the bee stung her hand so hard that she had to let go of the rose, which had already been slightly torn. Seeing blood from the stem, she called for a fairy to undo the spell. That's when the queen recognized her daughter and was overjoyed. A grand wedding was arranged, with many guests invited who came dressed in splendid attire. The hall was lit with 1,000 lights, and there was music and dancing until dawn. Were you also at the wedding? Yes, indeed, I was there. My headdress was made of butter, and when I stepped into the sun, it melted away. My dress was made of spider webs, and as I passed through thorns, they tore it to shreds. My slippers were made of glass, and when I stepped on a stone, they shattered. Princess Mouse Skin. There was a king who had 3 daughters. He wanted to know which one loved him the most, so he called them before him and asked. The eldest said she loved him more than the entire kingdom. The second, more than all the jewels and pearls in the world. But the youngest daughter said she loved him more than salt. The king was enraged that she compared her love for him to something so trivial, so he handed her over to a servant with orders to take her into the forest and kill her. As they entered the forest, the princess pleaded for her life. The servant, loyal to her, couldn't bring himself to harm her. She asked only for a dress made of mouse skin, which he provided, and she wrapped herself in it and fled. She went straight to the court of a neighboring king, disguised herself as a man, and asked to be employed in his service. The king agreed, and she was assigned the task of removing his boots every evening, which he would throw at her head. Once he asked where she was from, and she replied, "From the land where people don't throw boots at each other's heads." The king became curious, and eventually, when the other servants found a ring that Princess Mouseskin had supposedly lost, he suspected she had stolen it due to its value. He summoned her and asked about the ring. Unable to hide her true identity any longer, Princess Mouseskin shed the mouse skin, revealing her golden hair and stunning beauty. The king was so captivated that he took off his crown and placed it on her head, declaring her his queen. At the wedding, The father of Princess Mouse Skin was invited. He had believed his daughter long dead and did not recognize her. During the feast, all the dishes served to him were without salt, which angered him. He declared, "I would rather not live than eat such food." The queen then revealed herself to him, saying, "Now you refuse to live without salt, yet once you wanted to kill me because I said I loved you more than salt." Finally recognizing her, he kissed her, begged her forgiveness, and was happier than if he had regained his kingdom and all the jewels in the world to have found her again. The pear won't fall. The master wants to shake the pear tree, but the pear won't fall. The master sends out the servant to shake the pear tree. The servant doesn't shake the pear tree, the pear won't fall. So the master sends out the dog to bite the servant. The dog doesn't bite the servant doesn't shake the pear tree, the pear won't fall. So the master sends out the stick to hit the stick doesn't hit the dog doesn't bite the servant doesn't shake the pear tree, the pear won't fall. So the master sends out the fire to burn the fire doesn't burn the stick doesn't hit the dog doesn't bite the servant doesn't shake the pear tree, the pear won't fall. So the master sends out the water to extinguish the fire. The water doesn't extinguish the fire doesn't burn the stick doesn't hit the dog doesn't bite the servant doesn't shake the pear tree, the pear won't fall. So the master sends out the calf to drink the water. The calf doesn't drink the water doesn't extinguish the fire doesn't burn the stick doesn't hit the dog doesn't bite the servant doesn't shake the pear tree, the pear won't fall. So the master sends out the butcher to slaughter the calf. The butcher doesn't slaughter the calf doesn't drink the water doesn't extinguish the fire doesn't burn the stick doesn't hit the dog doesn't bite the servant doesn't shake the pear tree, the pear won't fall. So the master sends out the hangman to hang the butcher. The hangman will hang the butcher will slaughter the calf will drink the water will extinguish the fire will burn the stick will hit the dog will bite the servant will shake the pear tree, the pear will fall. 74. Of Johannes Wassersprung and Caspar Wassersprung. A king insisted that his daughter should not marry and had a house built for her in a forest in the utmost solitude, where she had to live with her maidens and saw no other people. Near the forest house, however, there was a spring with wonderful properties. The princess drank from it, and the result was that she gave birth to two princes, who were subsequently named Johannes Wassersprung and Caspar Wassersprung, and who were completely identical. Their grandfather, the old king, taught them hunting, and they grew up tall and handsome. The time came when they had to go out into the world. Each of them received a silver star, a horse, and a dog for the journey. They first came to a forest and saw two hares at the same time and wanted to shoot them, but the hares begged for mercy and said they should take them into their service, as they could be useful and provide help in any danger. The two brothers were persuaded and took them along as servants. Shortly after, two bears appeared, and as they aimed at them, the bears also cried for mercy and promised to serve faithfully. Thus their entourage was increased. Now they came to a crossroads, and they said, "We must part ways. One shall go right, the other left." But each stuck a knife into a tree at the crossroads, by the rust on which they would know how the other was doing and whether he was still alive. Then they took leave, kissed each other, and rode off. Johannes Wassersprung came to a city where everything was quiet and sad, because the princess was to be sacrificed to a dragon that was ravaging the whole country and could not be appeased otherwise. It was announced that whoever dared to risk his life and kill the dragon would have the princess as his wife, but no one had come forward. They had also tried to deceive the monster by sending out the princess's chambermaid, but it had recognized her and refused. Johannes Wassersprung thought, "You must try your luck. Maybe you will succeed," and set off with his companions towards the dragon's nest. The fight was fierce. The dragon spewed fire and flames, setting the grass around them on fire. so that Johannes Wassersprung would certainly have suffocated if the hare, dog, and bear had not stamped out and quenched the fire. Finally, the dragon had to succumb, and Johannes Wassersprung cut off its 7 heads, then cut out the tongues and put them in his pocket. But now he was so tired that he lay down on the spot and fell asleep. While he was sleeping, the princess's coachman came, and when he saw the man lying there with the 7 dragon heads beside him, he thought, "You must take advantage of this," stabbed Johannes Wassersprung to death, and took the 7 dragon heads with him. He went to the king, said he had killed the monster, brought the 7 heads as proof, and the princess became his bride. Meanwhile, Johannes Wassersprung's animals, who had lain down nearby and also slept after the battle, returned and found their master dead. They saw how the ants, whose hill had been trampled during the battle, smeared their dead with the sap of a nearby oak, which immediately brought them back to life. The bear went and fetched some of the sap and smeared it on Johannes Wassersprung, reviving him so that he soon became completely fresh and healthy again. He thought of the princess he had fought for and hurried to the city, where the wedding with the coachman was just being celebrated, and people said he had killed the 7-headed dragon. The dog and the bear ran into the castle, where the princess tied roast meat and wine around their necks and ordered her servants to follow the animals and invite the man to whom they belonged to the wedding. Thus, Johannes Wassersprung arrived at the wedding just as the dish with the 7 dragon heads that the coachman had brought was being served. Johannes Wassersprung pulled out the 7 tongues and placed them beside the heads, whereupon he was recognized as the true dragon slayer. The coachman was chased away, and he became the princess's husband. Not long after, he went hunting and pursued a stag with silver antlers. He chased it for a long time but could not catch it, and eventually came to an old woman who turned him, along with his dog, horse, and bear, into stone. Meanwhile, Caspar Wassersprung came to the tree where the 2 knives were stuck and saw that his brother's knife was rusted. He immediately decided to search for him, rode off, and came to the city where his brother's wife lived. Because he looked so much like his brother, she took him for her rightful husband, rejoiced at his return, and insisted that he stay with her. However, Caspar Wassersprung moved on, found his brother and his companions turned to stone, and forced the woman to lift the spell. The 2 brothers then rode home, and along the way, they agreed that the one to whom the princess would first throw her arms around should be her husband, and this happened to Johannes Wassersprung. 75. Phoenix Bird. One day, a rich man was walking by the river when a small box floated by. He took the box, opened the lid, and found a small child inside, which he took home and raised. However, the steward disliked the child, and once he took the child with him in a boat on the river. When he was in the middle of the river, he quickly jumped ashore, leaving the child alone in the boat. The boat drifted until it reached a mill, where the miller saw the child and took pity on it, rescuing and raising it in his house. But one day, the steward happened to come to the same mill, recognized the child, and took it with him. Soon after, he gave the young man a letter to deliver to his wife, which said, "Kill the bearer of this letter immediately." However, on the way, the young man met an old man in the forest, who said, "Let me see the letter you are carrying in your hand." The old man took the letter, turned it around, and gave it back. Now it read, "You should immediately give our daughter to the bearer of this letter as his wife." And so it happened, and when the steward heard of this, he was angered and said, "Hey, it won't be that easy. Before I let you have my daughter, you must first bring me 3 feathers from the phoenix bird." The young man set off in search of the phoenix bird, and in the same place in the forest, he again met the same old man, who said, "Keep walking all day, and in the evening you will come to a tree with 2 doves sitting on it. They will tell you what to do next." In the evening, he came to the tree, and the 2 doves were sitting on it. One dove said, "Anyone who wants to go to the phoenix bird must walk all day, and in the evening come to a gate that is locked." The other dove said, "Under this tree lies a golden key that unlocks the gate." He found the key and unlocked the gate with it. Behind the gate, 2 men were sitting. One man said, Anyone seeking the phoenix bird must make a long journey over the high mountain, and eventually he will come to the castle. On the evening of the third day, he finally reached the castle where a white maiden was sitting and said, "What do you want here?" "Oh, I would like to get 3 feathers from the phoenix bird." She said, "You are in mortal danger, for if the phoenix bird sees you, he will devour you whole, but I will see how I can help you get the 3 feathers. Every day he comes here, and I must comb him with a fine comb. Quickly hide under the table, which is draped with cloth all around." Just then the phoenix bird came home, sat down on the table, and said, I smell human flesh." "Oh, nonsense! You see well enough that no one is here," said the white maiden. "Comb me now," said the phoenix bird. The white maiden combed him, and he fell asleep. When he was fast asleep, she plucked a feather, pulled it out, and threw it under the table. He woke up. "Why are you tugging at me so?" "I dreamed that a person came and pulled out one of my feathers." But she calmed him down, and it went the same way the second and third time. When the young man had the 3 feathers, he returned home and was now able to marry his bride. From the Carpenter and Turner. A carpenter and a turner were to create their masterpieces. The carpenter made a table that could float by itself, and the turner made wings that allowed one to fly. Everyone said the carpenter's creation was better, so the turner took his wings, put them on, and flew out of the land, from morning till evening without stopping. In that land was a young prince who saw him flying and asked if he could borrow the wings, promising a good reward. The prince got the wings and flew until he came to another kingdom, where a tower was illuminated with many lights. He landed and inquired about the reason, learning that the most beautiful princess in the world lived there. Curious, he flew into an open window at evening. However, their time together was brief, and the matter was revealed. As a result, the prince and the princess were sentenced to death by burning. Meanwhile, the prince had taken his wings with him. When the flames began to rise towards them, he tied on the wings and escaped with the princess to his homeland. There, he settled down. Distressed by his absence, everyone recognized him when he revealed himself, and he was chosen as king. After some time, the father of the abducted princess announced that whoever brought his daughter back would receive half the kingdom. Upon hearing this, the prince assembled an army and brought the princess herself to her father, who was compelled to fulfill his promise. 81. The Smith and the Devil. Once upon a time, there was a smith who lived in comfort, squandered his money, engaged in many lawsuits, and after a couple of years had passed, he had not a penny left in his purse. "Why should I torment myself any longer in this world?" he thought, went out into the forest, and intended to hang himself from a tree. Just as he was about to put his neck in the noose, a man with a long white beard and a large book in his hand emerged from behind the tree. "Listen, Smith," he said, "write your name in this large book, and you will prosper for 10 years. But after that, you are mine, and I will take you away." "Who are you?" said the smith. "I am the devil." "What can you do?" "I can make myself as tall as a fir tree and as small as a mouse." "Then do it once so that I can see," said the smith, and the devil made himself as tall as a fir tree and as small as a mouse. "Very well," said the smith. "Give me the book. I will write my name in it." After he had signed, the devil said, "Just go home. You will find chests and boxes full, and because you did not hesitate, I will visit you once in that time." The smith went home, and indeed, all pockets, chests, and boxes were full of ducats, and he could take as much as he wanted. It was neither more nor less. Then he began his merry life again, invited his comrades, and was the happiest fellow in the world. A few years later, the devil visited him as promised, observed how things were going, and at parting gave him a leather sack. Whoever jumped into it could not get out until the smith let him out. This was how he amused himself. But after 10 years, the devil came and said to the smith, "The time is up. Now you are mine. Get ready to travel." "Very well," said the smith, put the leather sack on his back, and went away with the devil. When they came to the forest, to the spot where he had intended to hang himself, he said to the devil, "I must be absolutely certain that you are the devil. Make yourself as tall as a fir tree and as small as a mouse again." The devil agreed and did it, and when he had transformed into a mouse, The smith grabbed him and stuffed him into the sack. Then he cut a stick from the nearest tree, threw the sack down, and beat the devil with it. The devil screamed pitifully, ran back and forth in the bag, but in vain, he could not get out. Finally, the smith said, "I will let you go if you give me the page from your big book where I wrote my name." The devil did not want to, but eventually he had to. The page was torn out, and the devil went home to hell, angry that he had been tricked and beaten on top of it. The smith returned to his forge and lived happily as long as God willed. Eventually, he fell ill, and when he realized he was dying, he instructed that 2 good, long, sharp nails and a hammer should be placed in his coffin. This was done. When he died and arrived at the gates of heaven, he knocked, but St. Peter refused to let him in because he had been in league with the devil. Upon hearing this, the smith turned around and went to hell. However, the devil also refused to admit him, saying he didn't want him in hell as he would cause a disturbance. The smith grew angry and began to make a commotion in front of the gates of hell. A little devil became curious and wanted to see what the smith was up to, so it opened the door a crack and peeked out. The smith quickly grabbed it by the nose and nailed it to the door with one of the nails he had. The little devil began to scream like a banshee. Another devil was lured to the door and stuck its head out, but the smith wasted no time, grabbed it by the ear, and nailed it next to the first devil with the other nail. The 2 of them started such a dreadful uproar that the old devil himself came running. When he saw the 2 little devils nailed fast, he became extremely angry, started crying out of sheer spite, jumped around, and ran to heaven to the dear God, saying that they had to take the smith to heaven, no matter what, as he was nailing all the devils by their noses and ears, and he was no longer in control of hell. If God and St. Peter wanted to get rid of the devil, they had to take the smith to heaven. So now he sits in peace in heaven. As for how the 2 little devils eventually escaped, I do not know. 82. The Three Sisters. Once upon a time, there was a rich king who was so wealthy that he believed his riches could never run out. He lived in luxury, playing on a golden board with silver skittles. But after some time, his wealth began to decline. He pawned one city and castle after another, until only an old castle in the woods remained. There he lived with the queen and their three princesses, struggling to get by with nothing but potatoes, which they ate every day. One day, the king decided to go hunting, hoping to shoot a hare. He filled his pockets with potatoes and ventured into a nearby large forest. This forest was feared by all because terrible things were said to happen there. Bears that would devour people, eagles that would peck out eyes, wolves, lions, and all kinds of cruel creatures. But the king wasn't afraid at all and walked straight in. At first, he saw nothing but tall, mighty trees, and everything was quiet underneath them. After wandering around for a while and becoming hungry, he sat down under a tree to eat his potatoes. Suddenly, a bear emerged from the thicket, approached him, and growled, "How dare you sit by my honey tree? You'll pay dearly for this." The king was frightened and offered the bear his potatoes, trying to appease it. But the bear started speaking and said, "I don't want your potatoes. I want to eat you, and you can only save yourself by giving me your eldest daughter. If you do that, I'll also give you 100 weight of gold." Trembling at the thought of being eaten, the king agreed and said, "You shall have her. Just leave me in peace." The bear then showed him the way out and growled, "I'll come in 7 days to fetch my bride." The king returned home bravely, thinking that surely the bear couldn't crawl through a keyhole, and he made sure everything was securely locked. He raised all the drawbridges and told his daughter to keep up her spirits. To keep her safe from the bear bridegroom, he hid her in a small room high up under the battlements, where she remained hidden until the 7 days were up. On the seventh morning, very early while everyone was still asleep, a magnificent carriage drawn by 6 horses and surrounded by many riders dressed in gold arrived at the castle. As it approached, the drawbridges lowered by themselves and the locks sprang open without keys. The carriage entered the courtyard, and a young, handsome prince stepped out. The king woke up to the noise, looked out the window, and saw the prince taking his eldest daughter from the locked room and lifting her into the carriage. All he could do was call after her, "Farewell, dear maiden fair. Go, bear's bride, go where?" She waved her white handkerchief at him from the carriage, and then they sped away as if the wind had been harnessed, deeper into the enchanted forest. The king, however, was heavy-hearted to have given his daughter to a bear, and for 3 days he wept with the queen, so sorrowful was he. But on the 4th day, after he had cried his fill, he thought, "What's done is done, and cannot be changed." He descended into the courtyard, where there stood a chest of ebony, incredibly heavy to lift. Remembering what the bear had promised him, he opened it to find 100 weight of gold, shimmering and gleaming. When the king saw the gold, he was comforted and redeemed his cities and kingdom, resuming his former life of luxury. This lasted as long as the 100 weight of gold lasted. After that, he had to pawn everything again and return to the forest castle, eating potatoes once more. The king had a falcon that he took with him one day into the fields to hunt, hoping for something better to eat. The falcon soared up and flew towards the dark, enchanted forest, where the king dared not venture again. But as soon as it reached there, an eagle swooped out and chased the falcon back to the king. The king tried to fend off the eagle with his spear, but the eagle seized the spear and broke it like a reed. Then it crushed the falcon with a talon and slashed at the king's shoulder, saying, "Why do you disturb my realm of the air? For this you shall die, or you shall give me your second daughter in marriage." The king replied, "Yes, you shall have her, but what will you give me in return?" 200 weight of gold," said the eagle, "and in 7 weeks I will come to fetch her." With that, he released the king and flew off into the forest. The king was distraught to have sold his second daughter to a wild animal and dared not tell her anything about it. 6 weeks passed, and on the 7th, the princess went out to a lawn in front of the castle to water her linen. Suddenly, a magnificent procession of handsome knights arrived, with the most beautiful among them riding at the front. He dismounted and called out, "Hurry, hurry, maiden fair, come with me, beautiful eagle bride." Before she could reply, he had already lifted her onto his horse and galloped with her into the forest, like a bird taking flight. "Farewell! Farewell!" rang out from the castle. They waited a long time for the princess to return, but she did not come. Finally, the king realized that in his desperation, he had promised her to an eagle, and the eagle had come to claim her. When the king's sadness had eased a little, he remembered the eagle's promise and descended to the lawn where he found 2 golden eggs, each weighing 100 weight. "Whoever has gold is pious enough," he thought, and banished all his heavy thoughts from his mind. Thus, the merry life began anew and lasted until the 200 weight of gold were also spent. Then the king returned once more to the forest castle, and the remaining princess had to boil the potatoes. The king no longer wished to hunt hares in the forest or birds in the air, but he enjoyed eating fish. So the princess had to knit a net, and he went to a pond not far from the forest. There was a boat on it, so he got in and cast the net. He caught a lot of beautiful red-spotted trout in one throw. But as he tried to bring them ashore, the boat became stuck, and he couldn't free it no matter how hard he tried. Suddenly, a gigantic whale appeared and snorted, "Why are you stealing my subjects? This shall cost you your life." With that, he opened his enormous mouth as if to swallow the king and the boat whole. Terrified by the dreadful mouth before him, the king lost all courage. Then he remembered his third daughter and cried out, "Spare my life, and you shall have my youngest daughter." "So be it," growled the whale. "I will also give you something in return. I have no use for gold. It's too common for me, but the bottom of my lake is paved with pearl shells. I will give you 3 sacks full of them. In the 7th moon, I will come to fetch my bride." Then he dove under the water. The king rowed back to shore and brought his trout home. But when they were cooked, he couldn't bring himself to eat any of them. Whenever he looked at his daughter, the only one left to him, the most beautiful and beloved of them all, it felt as though 1,000 knives were piercing his heart. 6 months passed, and the queen and princess didn't know what was troubling the king, who hadn't shown a happy face during all that time. In the 7th moon, the princess stood in the courtyard by a reed fountain, filling a glass with water. Suddenly, a carriage arrived with 6 white horses and silver-clad attendants. A prince stepped out of the carriage, so handsome that she had never seen anyone more beautiful in her life. He asked her for a glass of water. As she handed him the glass she held, he embraced her and lifted her into the carriage. They then drove back out through the gate, across the field towards the pond. "Farewell, maiden fair. Go, beautiful whale's bride." The queen stood at the window and watched the carriage in the distance. When she didn't see her daughter, her heart sank heavily. She called and searched for her everywhere, but she was nowhere to be found. Finally, she knew what had happened and began to weep. The king then revealed to her that a whale had taken her away, and he had promised her to him, which was why he had been so sad. He tried to comfort her and told her about the great wealth they would receive in return, but the queen wanted none of it. She said her only child was dearer to her than all the treasures in the world. While the whale prince had abducted the princess, his servants had brought 3 mighty sacks into the castle. The king found them at the door, and when he opened them, they were full of beautiful large pearl shells, as big as the thickest peas. Suddenly, he was rich again, richer than he had ever been. He redeemed his cities and castles, but he didn't return to a life of luxury. He lived quietly and frugally. Whenever he thought about how his 3 beloved daughters might be faring with the wild animals who might have already devoured them, all his joy vanished. But the queen could not be comforted and shed more tears for her daughter than the whale had given pearls. Finally, it became a little quieter, and after some time, she became happy again because she gave birth to a beautiful boy. And since God had given the child so unexpectedly, he was called Reynold, the Wonder Child. The boy grew up strong and tall, and the queen often told him about his 3 sisters, who were held captive by 3 animals in the enchanted forest. When he was 16 years old, he asked the king for armor and a sword, and when he received them, he wanted to go on adventures, blessed his parents, and set off. He went straight to the enchanted forest and had nothing else in mind but to search for his sisters. At first, he wandered for a long time in the great forest without encountering any person or animal. But after 3 days, he saw a young woman sitting in front of a cave, playing with a young bear. Another very young bear lay on her lap. Reinhold thought, "Surely this is my eldest sister." He left his horse behind and approached her. "Dearest sister, I am your brother Reinhold, and I have come to visit you." The princess looked at him, and seeing that he resembled their father completely, she did not doubt his words, but was alarmed and said, "Oh, dearest brother, hurry and run away as fast as you can if you value your life. My husband, the bear, will come home soon, and if he finds you here, he will devour you mercilessly." But Reinhold replied, "I am not afraid, and I will not leave you until I know how you are faring." Seeing that he was determined, the princess led him into her cave, which was dark and resembled a bear's den. On one side was a pile of leaves and hay where the old bear and his cubs slept. On the other side was a magnificent bed adorned with red fabric and gold, belonging to the princess. She instructed Reinhold to crawl under the bed and handed him some food. It didn't take long before the bear returned home. "I smell human flesh," he growled, trying to stick his thick head under the bed. But the princess called out, "Be quiet! Who would come in here?" "I found and ate a horse in the forest," he grumbled, his snout still bloody. "There must be a human with it, and I smell it," he said, trying once again to reach under the bed. The princess kicked him in the belly, causing him to stagger back to his bed, put his paw in his mouth, and fell asleep. Every 7 days, the bear would assume his human form as a handsome prince, and his cave would transform into a magnificent castle, with the animals in the forest serving as his servants. On such days, he would fetch the princess. Beautiful young women would welcome her outside the castle. It was a splendid feast, and she slept in happiness. But when she woke up, she found herself in a dark bear's den, and her husband had turned back into a bear, grumbling at her feet. Only the bed and everything she touched remained unchanged in its natural state. She lived in sorrow for 6 days, but on the seventh she was comforted. Since she did not age and only counted one day, she was content with her life. She had borne 2 princes to her husband, who were bears for 6 days and human on the seventh. Each time, she filled her bed straw with the finest foods, cakes, and fruits, which sustained her for the whole week, and the bear obeyed her and did as she wished. When Renaud woke up, he found himself in a silk bed. Servants attended to him and dressed him in the richest clothes, for it was the 7th day. His sister entered with 2 handsome princes and her bear husband, rejoicing in his arrival. Everything was splendid and magnificent, and the entire day was filled with joy and merriment. In the evening, however, the princess said, "Dear brother, now you must leave. At daybreak, my husband will turn back into a bear. And if he finds you here tomorrow, he will not be able to resist his nature and will devour you." Then the bear prince gave him 3 bear hairs and said, "Rub these in times of need, and I will come to your aid." They kissed and bid farewell, and Reinhold got into a carriage drawn by 6 bay horses and departed. Thus he went over hill and dale, through deserts and forests, over nest and hedge, without rest or respite, until toward morning, as the sky began to gray, Reinhold suddenly found himself lying on the ground. His horse and carriage had disappeared, and at dawn he saw 6 ants scurrying along, dragging a nutshell. Reinhold realized that he was still in the enchanted forest and set out to find his second sister. For another 3 days, he wandered fruitlessly in the solitude, but on the 4th day, he heard a great eagle swoop down and settle on a nest. Reinhold hid in the bushes and waited until the eagle flew away again. After 7 hours, it soared back up. Reinhold emerged, approached the tree, and called out, "Dearest sister, are you up there? Let me hear your voice. I am Reinhold, your brother, and I have come to visit you." He heard her call down, "If you are Reinhold, my dearest brother whom I have not yet seen, come up to me." Reinhold tried to climb up, but the trunk was too thick and smooth. He tried 3 times in vain. Then a silk rope ladder fell down, and he quickly climbed up to the eagle's nest, which was sturdy and secure like a balcony on a linden tree. His sister sat under a canopy of rose-colored silk, and on her lap lay an eagle's egg, which she kept warm as if to hatch it. They embraced and rejoiced, But after a while, the princess said, "Now hurry, dearest brother, you must leave. If my husband the eagle sees you, he will pluck out your eyes and devour your heart, as he did to 3 of your servants who sought you in the forest." Reynold replied, "No, I will stay here until your husband is transformed. That will not happen for another 6 weeks, but if you can endure it, hide inside the hollow tree. I will lower food down to you every day." Reynold crawled into the tree, and every day the princess lowered food to him. When the eagle flew away, he would come up to her. After 6 weeks, the transformation occurred, and Reynold woke up again in a bed similar to the one with his bear brother-in-law, only more magnificent. He lived in joy for 7 days with the eagle prince. On the 7th evening, they bid farewell. The eagle gave him 3 eagle feathers and said, "Rub these in times of need, and I will come to your aid." Then he sent servants with him to show him the way. But when morning came, they had vanished, leaving Reynold alone in a dreadful wilderness on a high cliff. Reynold looked around and in the distance saw the reflection of a large lake, just catching the first rays of sunlight. He thought of his third sister being there. He began to descend, navigating through bushes and between rocks. 3 days he spent at it, often losing sight of the lake, but on the 4th morning, he reached it. He stood on the shore and called out, "Dearest sister, are you in there? Let me hear your voice. I am Reynold, your brother, and I have come to visit you." But no one answered, and everything was silent. He crumbled breadcrumbs into the water and spoke to the fish. "Dear fish, go to my sister and tell her that Reynold, the wonderkind, is here and wishes to see her." But the red-spotted trout snapped up the bread and paid no heed to his words. Then he saw a boat. He immediately discarded his armor, keeping only his shining sword in hand, and jumped into the ship, rowing away. After a long swim, he saw a chimney made of rock crystal jutting above the water, emitting a pleasant smell. Reynold rowed towards it, thinking, "Surely my sister lives down there." He then seated himself in the chimney and slid down. The princess was startled when she suddenly saw a pair of human legs flailing in the chimney. Soon, a whole man came down and revealed himself as her brother. She rejoiced from the bottom of her heart, but then grew sorrowful and said, "The whale heard that you were coming to find me. He lamented that if you came and he was still a whale, he wouldn't be able to resist devouring you and would shatter my crystal house, causing both of us to perish in the waters." Reynold asked, "Can't you hide me until the time comes when the magic is over?" "Oh no, how could that be possible? Can't you see the walls are all crystal and completely transparent?" She thought and thought. Finally, she remembered the wooden chamber. She cleverly arranged the wood so that nothing could be seen from the outside and concealed the wunderkind inside. Shortly thereafter, the whale arrived, and the princess trembled like a leaf. He circled the crystal house a few times, and when he saw a piece of Reynold's clothing sticking out from the wood, he thrashed his tail and snorted loudly. If he had seen more, he surely would have smashed the house. He came around once a day until finally, in the 7th month, the enchantment ceased. Reynold found himself in a castle that surpassed even the eagles in splendor, situated on a beautiful island. He lived with his sister and her husband in joy for a whole month. When that time was over, the whale gave him 3 scales and said, "Rub these in times of need, and I will come to your aid." Then he let him sail back to shore, where he found his armor once more. The wonderkind continued on for 7 days in the wilderness, sleeping under the open sky for 7 nights, until it spotted a castle with a steel gate and a mighty lock. In front of it stood a black bull with sparkling eyes, guarding the entrance. Reynold approached and delivered a powerful blow to its neck, but the neck was made of steel, and the sword shattered as if it were glass. He attempted to use his lance, but it bent like a straw, and the bull caught him with its horns, tossing him into the air where he got caught in the branches of a tree. In his distress, Reynold remembered the 3 bear hairs, rubbed them in his hand, and at that moment, a bear came trotting by. It fought with the bull and tore it apart. However, from the bull's belly, a bird of paradise flew out hastily. Reynold then rubbed the 3 eagle feathers. Immediately, a powerful eagle swooped down from the sky and pursued the bird, which fled towards a pond. The eagle shot down upon it, tearing it apart. Reynold had seen it drop a golden egg into the water. He rubbed the 3 fish scales in his hand, and a whale immediately swam up, swallowed the egg, and spit it out onto land. Reinhold took it and cracked it open with a stone, finding a small key inside, the key that opened the steel gate. As soon as he touched the gate with it, it sprang open by itself. He entered, and the bolts on the other doors slid back on their own. Through 7 chambers illuminated brightly, he entered into 7 magnificent chambers. In the last chamber, a maiden lay asleep on a bed. She was so beautiful that he was utterly dazzled. He tried to wake her, but to no avail. She slept as deeply as if dead. In anger, he struck a black tablet standing next to the bed. At that moment, the maiden awoke briefly, but fell back asleep. He took the tablet and smashed it onto the stone floor, shattering it into 1,000 pieces. Hardly had this happened when the maiden's eyes opened brightly, and the spell was broken. She was the sister of Reinhold's 3 brothers-in-law. Because she had refused the love of a wicked sorcerer, he had cast her into a deathly slumber and transformed her brothers into animals. This was to last as long as the black tablet remained intact. Reinhold led the maiden out, and as they approached the gate, his 3 brothers-in-law rode up from 3 directions, now freed. With them were their wives and children, and the eagle bride had hatched the egg, holding a beautiful young lady in her arms. They all returned to the old king and queen, and the wunderkind brought his 3 sisters back home. Soon after, he married the beautiful maiden, and joy and happiness filled every corner. And the cat ran home. My fairy tale is done. The Faithful Animals. Once upon a time, there was a man who didn't have much money left. With what little he had, he set off into the wide world. He came to a village where the children were running around, shouting and making a racket. "What are you up to, children?" said the man. "Oh, we have a mouse here that must dance for us. Look what fun it is. See how it skips around." But the man felt sorry for the poor little creature and said, "Let the mouse go, children, and I will give you money too." So he gave them money, and they let the mouse go, which ran as fast as it could into a hole. The man went on his way and came to another village where the children had a monkey that had to dance and do somersaults, and they laughed at it and didn't leave the animal alone. So the man gave them money too, to let the monkey go. After that, the man came to a third village where the children had a bear that they made dance, and they were pleased when it growled. The man bought the bear's freedom as well, and the bear was happy to be back on its 4 feet and trotted away. Now the man had spent all his remaining money and had not a penny left in his pocket. He said to himself, "The king has so much in his treasury that he doesn't need. I won't starve. I'll take something from there, and when I get money again, I can put it back." So he went to the treasury and took a little of it. But as he was sneaking out, the king's men caught him. They said he was a thief and brought him to trial, where he was sentenced to be set adrift in a box on the water. The lid of the box had holes in it for air, and they gave him a jug of water and a loaf of bread. As he floated on the water, full of fear, he heard something scratching at the lock, gnawing and snorting. Suddenly, the lock sprang open by itself, and the lid lifted up, revealing the mouse, monkey, and bear standing there. They had done it because he had helped them, and now they wanted to help him in return. They didn't know what more to do, so they talked it over. Just then, a white stone came floating on the water, looking like a round egg. The bear said, "That's come at the right time. It's a magic stone. Whoever owns it can wish for whatever they desire." So the man caught the stone, and holding it in his hand, he wished for a castle with a garden and a stable. Almost instantly, he found himself in the castle with the garden and stable, and everything was so beautiful and magnificent that he couldn't believe his eyes. After a while, merchants passed by on their way. "Look," they exclaimed, "what a splendid castle stands here. Last time we passed by, there was nothing but sand." Curious, they went inside and asked the man how he had managed to build everything so quickly. He replied, "I didn't do it. It was my magic stone." "What kind of stone is that?" they asked. So he went and fetched it to show them. The merchants were very interested and asked if it could be traded, offering all their beautiful wares in exchange. The man's eyes were dazzled by the goods, and his heart, being fickle, was deceived into thinking the beautiful goods were worth more than his magic stone, so he gave it away. But as soon as he had let go of the stone, all his luck vanished, and suddenly he found himself again in the closed box floating on the river, with a jug of water and a loaf of bread. The faithful animals, mouse, monkey, and bear, saw his misfortune and came again to help him. But this time, they couldn't even break open the castle because it was much stronger than before. Then the bear said, "We must retrieve the magic stone, or all is lost." Since the merchants were still living in the castle, the animals went together, and when they got close, the bear said, "Mouse, go and peek through the keyhole and see what can be done. You're small, no one will notice you." The mouse agreed, but returned and said, "I can't do it. I looked in. The stone hangs under the mirror on a red ribbon, and on both sides sit a couple of big cats with fiery eyes guarding it." The other said, "Go back in and wait until the master is in bed and asleep. Then sneak in through a hole and crawl onto the bed, pinch his nose, and bite his hair." The mouse went back in and did as the others had said. The master woke up, rubbed his nose, was annoyed, and said, "These cats are good for nothing. They let the mice bite the hair off my head and chased them both away." Thus, the mouse won the game. As soon as the master had fallen asleep again the other night, the mouse crept in, nibbled and gnawed at the red ribbon holding the stone until it snapped and fell down. Then she dragged it to the house door. This made the poor little mouse very angry, and she said to the monkey, who was already on the lookout, "Now you take your paw and pull it all the way out." It was easy for the monkey. He grabbed the stone, and they went together to the river. There, the monkey said, "But how do we get to the box now?" The bear said, "That's easy. I'll go into the water and swim. Monkey, sit on my back, but hold on tight with your hands and take the stone in your mouth. Little mouse, you can sit in my right ear." So they did, and they swam down the river. After a while, the bear grew quiet, started talking, and said, "Listen, monkey, aren't we good comrades? What do you think?" But the monkey didn't answer and remained silent. "Well," said the bear, "won't you give me an answer? That's a bad fellow who doesn't respond." When the monkey heard this, he opened his mouth, dropped the stone into the water, and said, "I couldn't answer. I had the stone in my mouth. Now it's gone, and it's all your fault." "Stay calm," said the bear. "We'll think of something." They consulted and called the frogs, toads, and all the creatures living in the water, saying, "A powerful enemy is coming. Gather many stones, and we'll build a wall to protect you." The animals were frightened and dragged stones from all directions. Finally, an old fat bullfrog surfaced from the depths with the red ribbon and the magic stone in its mouth. When the bear saw this, he was pleased. "Now we have what we need." He took the burden from the frog, told the animals it was all good, and bid them farewell. Then the three went down to the man in the box, used the stone to break the lid, and arrived just in time. He had already finished the bread and drunk the water and was nearly starving. But when he held the stone in his hands again, he wished himself fresh and healthy, back in his beautiful castle with the garden and stable. He lived happily, and the three animals stayed with him and had a good life forever after. The Crows. There was an honest soldier who had earned and saved some money through hard work, unlike his comrades who squandered theirs in taverns. Two of his comrades, however, had deceitful hearts and wanted to rob him of his money. Outwardly, they pretended to be friendly. One day they said to him, "Listen, why should we stay in this town? It feels like we're trapped here, like prisoners. Especially someone like you could earn a decent living and live happily at home." They persisted with such talk until he finally agreed to run away with them. However, the two others had nothing else in mind but to take his money from him outside the town. After they had gone a distance, the two said, "We should turn right here if we want to reach the border." "No way. That just leads back into town. We should go left to go further." "Why are you being so stubborn?" they shouted, pressing him, hitting him until he fell down, and taking his money from his pockets. But that wasn't enough. They also gouged out his eyes, dragged him to the gallows, and tied him firmly to it. Then they left him there and returned to town with the stolen money. The poor blind man didn't know where he was, feeling around and realizing he was sitting under a wooden beam. He thought it was a cross and said, "It's good of them to at least tie me under a cross. God is with me," and began to pray earnestly to God. As night approached, he heard something fluttering. It was 3 crows that settled on the beam. He then heard one say, "Sister, what good news do you bring? If only people knew what we know. The princess is sick, and the old king has promised her hand to whoever can heal her. But no one can, because she will only recover if the toad in that pond is burnt to ash and she drinks the ashes." Then the second crow said, "Yes, if only people knew what we know. Tonight, dew will fall from the sky, so wonderful and healing. Whoever is blind and applies it to their eyes will regain their sight." Finally, the third crow said, "Yes, if only people knew what we know. The toad can only help one person, and the dew only a few. But there is great need in the city. All the wells have dried up, and no one knows that the large square stone in the market must be removed and dug underneath, where the most beautiful water springs forth." After the crows spoke, they flew away, and the blind man gradually freed himself from his bonds. He bent down, plucked a few blades of grass, and applied the dew that had fallen on them to his eyes. Immediately, his sight returned, and he could see the moon and stars in the sky, realizing he was standing next to the gallows. He then collected as much of the precious dew as he could find and went to the pond, where he dug out the water and retrieved the toad. He burned it to ash and took it to the king's court. There, he had the princess drink the ashes, and when she was healed, he demanded her hand in marriage as promised. However, the king was displeased with him because of his ragged clothes. He said that anyone who wanted his daughter's hand must first bring water to the city, hoping to rid himself of the soldier. Undeterred, the soldier instructed the people to remove the square stone in the market and dig underneath. They did so and soon discovered a beautiful spring with abundant water. Unable to refuse him any longer, the king gave his daughter to the soldier in marriage, and they lived happily together. Once, as he was strolling through the fields, he encountered his 2 former comrades who had acted so treacherously towards him. They did not recognize him, but he immediately recognized them. He approached them and said, "Look, here is your former comrade, whose eyes you shamefully gouged out. But by God's grace, fortune has smiled upon me." They fell at his feet, begging for mercy. Because he had a kind heart, he took pity on them, brought them along, and provided them with food and clothes. He then told them how he had fared and how he had achieved his current honors. Upon hearing this, the two could not rest and decided to sit under the gallows one night to see if they might also hear something good. As they sat under the gallows, something soon fluttered above their heads, and the 3 crows arrived. One crow said to the others, "Listen, sisters, someone must have overheard us. The princess is well, the toad is gone from the pond, a blind man has regained his sight, and they have dug a fresh well in the city. Come, let's search. Perhaps we will find him." They fluttered down and found the 2 men. Before they could defend themselves, the crows perched on their heads and pecked out their eyes. They continued pecking at their faces until they were dead. They lay there under the gallows. When the crows did not return after a few days, their former comrade wondered where they might have wandered off to. He went out to search for them, but found nothing but their bones. He carried their remains away from the gallows and laid them to rest in a grave. 33. The Lazy One and the Industrious One. Once upon a time, there were 2 apprentice craftsmen who traveled together and vowed to stick together. However, when they arrived in a large city, one of them, called Brother Lazy, became dissolute. He forgot his promise, abandoned his companion, and went off on his own, seeking pleasure wherever he could find it. The other apprentice stayed true to his word, worked diligently, and continued his journey. One night, he passed by a gallows without knowing it, but on the ground below, he saw someone lying there, sleeping. The person was poor and naked, and because it was starlit, he recognized his former companion. He lay down beside him, covered him with his cloak, and fell asleep. Before long, he was awakened by 2 voices conversing. They belonged to 2 ravens perched atop the gallows. One raven said, "God provides." The other replied, "Act accordingly." One of the ravens then fell weakly to the ground after speaking, while the other remained by its side, waiting until daybreak. Then it fetched some worms and water, refreshed the fallen raven, and revived it from death. The 2 apprentice craftsmen were amazed by what they witnessed. They asked the sick raven why the other raven had been so wretched and sickly. The sick raven replied, "Because I didn't want to do anything and believed that sustenance came from heaven." The two craftsmen took the ravens with them to the nearest village. One raven was lively and foraged for its food, bathing every morning and grooming itself with its beak. The other raven, however, sat in corners, was moody, and always looked disheveled. After some time, the daughter of the household, who was a beautiful girl, grew fond of the industrious raven. She picked him up from the ground, stroked him with her hand, and eventually pressed him to her face and kissed him with joy. The bird fell to the ground, rolled around, fluttered, and transformed into a handsome young man. He then explained that the other raven was his brother, and both had offended their father, who had cursed them, saying, "Fly as ravens until a beautiful girl kisses you willingly." Thus, one was redeemed, but no one wanted to kiss the lazy raven, and he died as a raven. Brother Lazy took this as a lesson, became diligent and orderly, and stayed with his companion. 36. The Long Nose. There were 3 old discharged soldiers who were so old that they couldn't even bite into leftover milk bread. The king sent them away without a pension, leaving them with nothing to live on, forcing them to beg. They traveled through a vast forest, unable to find its end. When evening came, 2 of them fell asleep, and the third had to keep watch to protect them from wild animals. As the 2 slept and the third stood watch, a little man in red clothing approached and called out, "Who goes there?" "Good friend," said the soldier. "What kind of good friend?" "3 old discharged soldiers who have nothing to live on." The little man said he should come to him. He would give him something, and if he followed his instructions, he would have plenty for the rest of his life. The soldier approached, and the little man gave him an old cloak. When he wore it and made a wish, it would come true. However, he was told not to tell his comrades until daybreak. When morning came and they woke up, he told them what had happened. They continued traveling until the second evening, whereupon the second soldier kept watch while the other 2 slept. The little red man arrived again, asking, "Who goes there?" "Good friend." "What kind of good friend?" 3 old discharged soldiers. The little man gave him an old pouch that would never empty of money, no matter how much was taken out. Like the first soldier, he was instructed to keep this gift a secret until daybreak. They traveled through the forest for a 3rd day, and at night the 3rd soldier stood guard. The little red man appeared once more and asked, "Who goes there?" "Good friend." "What kind of good friend?" 3 old discharged soldiers. The little man gave him a horn that, when blown, would gather all peoples together. In the morning, each soldier used his gift. The first put on the cloak and wished to be out of the forest, and immediately they were outside. They went to an inn and ordered the best food and drink the innkeeper could provide. When they finished, the soldier with the pouch paid for everything without taking a penny from the innkeeper. 36. The Long Nose. They were tired of traveling, and the one with the pouch said to the one with the cloak, "I wish you would wish us a castle there. We have enough money. We could live like princes." So he wished for a castle, and instantly it appeared, complete with all its furnishings. After living there for a while, he wished for a carriage with 3 gray horses, so they could travel to another kingdom and pass themselves off as 3 royal sons. They departed with a grand retinue of servants, making a princely appearance. They arrived at a king's court who had only 1 daughter, and upon their arrival, they announced themselves and were invited to dine and spend the night. They enjoyed themselves thoroughly, eating, drinking, and playing cards, which the princess enjoyed very much. She played cards with the soldier who had the pouch, and as much as she won from him, she saw that his pouch never emptied, suspecting it was a magical object. She suggested he was warm from the game and should drink some wine, secretly adding a sleeping potion. As soon as he drank it, he fell asleep. The princess then took his pouch, went to her chamber, sewed a similar-looking one, put some money in it, and replaced the original. The next morning, the 3 soldiers continued their journey. When the one with the pouch tried to retrieve more money, he found it empty and remained empty. He cried out, "My pouch has been swapped by the false princess. Now we are poor." However, the one with the cloak reassured him, saying, "Don't worry. I'll get it back soon." He put on the cloak, wished himself into the princess's chamber, and appeared instantly. She was counting the money she had continuously taken from the pouch. When she saw him, she screamed, accusing him of being a robber, which alarmed the entire court, causing them to rush in to capture him. In his haste to escape, he jumped out the window, leaving behind his cloak and disappearing. When the three reunited, they had nothing left except the horn. The owner of the horn said, "I will help. We will start a war," and blew the horn, summoning so many hussars and cavalry that they couldn't all be counted. He sent a message to the king, demanding the return of the pouch and cloak, threatening to raise his castle if they were not returned. The king pleaded with his daughter to hand them over to avoid disaster, but she refused, insisting on trying something else first. Dressing as a poor girl with a basket on her arm, she went out to the army camp to sell various drinks, accompanied by her chambermaid. When she began to sing so beautifully in the middle of the camp, the entire army came out of their tents to listen, including the one who possessed the horn. Seeing him there, she signaled to her chambermaid, who sneaked into his tent, took the horn, and ran back to the castle with it. Then she returned home, now in possession of everything, while the three comrades had to go back to begging. So they went their separate ways. The one who had the pouch said, "You know what? We can't always be together. You go that way, I'll go this way." He went alone and entered a forest, where he grew tired and lay down under a tree to rest. When he woke up and looked above him, he saw a beautiful apple tree under which he had slept, adorned with magnificent apples. Hungry, he took one apple and ate it, then another. Suddenly, his nose began to grow and continued growing until it was so long that he couldn't get up anymore. It extended through the forest and stretched out for 60 miles beyond. Meanwhile, his companions traveled the world searching for him because they preferred being together, but they couldn't find him. Suddenly, one of them stumbled upon something and stepped on something soft. "What could this be?" he thought. Upon closer inspection, it turned out to be a nose. They decided to follow the nose and eventually reached their friend in the forest, lying there unable to move. They took a pole, wrapped it around the long nose, and tried to lift him up to carry him away, but he was too heavy. They found a donkey in the forest, placed him and the long nose on two poles, and thus managed to transport him. After dragging him a short distance, they grew tired and had to rest. While resting, they noticed a tree nearby, laden with beautiful pears. Behind the tree emerged the little red man who told the long-nosed one to eat one of the pears, and his nose would fall off. He did so, and immediately his long nose fell off, leaving him as he was before. The little man then advised him, "Collect apples and pears. Make powder from each. Whoever you give the apple powder to will grow a nose, and when you give them pear powder, it will fall off again. Then travel as a doctor, give the princess some of the apples and then the powder. Her nose will grow 20 times longer than yours did, but hold on tight." Taking the apples, he went to the royal court and presented himself as a gardener's apprentice, claiming to have a type of apple that grew nowhere else in the kingdom. When the princess heard about this, she asked her father to buy her some of these apples. The king agreed, saying, "Buy as many as you like." She bought and ate one, which tasted so good to her that she thought she had never eaten such a good one in her life, and then ate another. When that happened, the doctor left. Then her nose began to grow and grew so much that she could not get up from the chair, but fell over. The nose grew 60 ells around the table, 60 around her cupboard, and then through the window 100 ells around the castle, and 20 more miles out into the city. There she lay, unable to move or budge, and no doctor knew how to help her. The old king had it announced that if any stranger could help his daughter, he should have much money. Now the old soldier had been waiting for this, and presented himself as a doctor. If it be God's will, he would help her. He then gave her powder made from the apples, and her nose began to grow anew and became even larger. In the evening, he gave her powder made from the pears, and it became a little smaller, but not much. The next day, he gave her apple powder again to frighten and punish her properly, and it grew again much more than it had diminished yesterday. Finally, he said, "Most gracious princess, you must have stolen something once. If you do not give it back, no remedy will help. She said, "I know nothing about it." He said, "It is so, otherwise my powder would help, and if you do not give it back, you must die from the long nose." Then the old king said, "Give back the purse, the mantle, and the horn that you stole, otherwise your nose can never get any smaller." So the chambermaid had to fetch all three items and lay them down, and he gave her powder made from the pears, and the nose fell off, and 250 men had to come and cut it to pieces. And he left with the purse, the mantle, and the horn to join his comrades, and they wished themselves back into their castle. There they are likely to sit and keep house. The Lion and the Frog. There was a king and queen who had a son and a daughter who loved each other dearly. The prince often went hunting and sometimes stayed out in the forest for a long time, but once he did not return at all. His sister cried herself nearly blind over this, and finally, unable to bear it any longer, she went into the forest to search for her brother. After walking long distances, she grew tired and, looking around, saw a lion standing beside her. The lion was very friendly and looked kind. She sat on his back, and the lion carried her away, stroking her cheeks with his tail to cool them. After they had walked quite a distance, they came to a cave. The lion took her inside, and she was not afraid because the lion was so friendly. They went through the cave, which became darker and finally completely pitch black. After a while, they emerged back into daylight in a beautiful garden. Everything was fresh and shining in the sun, and in the middle stood a magnificent palace. When they approached the gate, the lion stopped, and the princess got off his back. Then the lion began to speak and said, "You shall live in this beautiful house and serve me. If you fulfill everything I ask of you, you will see your brother again." So the princess served the lion and obeyed him in all things. Once, as she was walking in the garden, beautiful though it was, she felt sad because she was so alone and abandoned by the whole world. As she walked back and forth, she noticed a pond with a small island in the middle, and on the island was a tent. There she saw a bright green frog sitting under the tent, wearing a rose petal on its head instead of a cap. The frog looked at her and said, "Why are you so sad?" "Ah," she said, "why shouldn't I be sad?" and told him all her troubles. The frog spoke kindly. "If you need anything, just come to me, and I will help you with advice and action." "But how can I repay you?" she asked. "You don't need to repay me," said the frog. "Just bring me a fresh rose petal for my cap every day." So the princess returned somewhat comforted, and whenever the lion demanded something, she ran to the pond, where the frog leapt back and forth and soon brought her what she needed. One day the lion said, "Tonight I would like to eat a mosquito pie, but it must be well prepared." The princess thought, "How can I manage that? It's completely impossible," and ran out to tell her frog. The frog said, "Don't worry, I will fetch a mosquito pie for you." Then he sat down, opened his mouth wide, left and right, snapped up mosquitoes as many as he needed, hopped around gathering wood shavings, and started a fire. When it was burning, he kneaded the pie and baked it over coals, and in less than 2 hours, it was ready and as good as anyone could wish. Then he said to the girl, "But you won't get the pie until you promise to cut off the lion's head with a sword hidden behind his bed as soon as he falls asleep." "No," she said, "I won't do that. The lion has always been kind to me." The frog said, "If you don't do that, you will never see your brother again, and you won't harm the lion either." So she took courage, took the pie, and brought it to the lion. "That looks very good," said the lion, sniffed it, and began to bite into it right away, eating it all up. When he was done, he felt tired and wanted to sleep a little. So he said to the princess, "Come and sit beside me and scratch me behind the ears until I fall asleep." She sat beside him, scratched him with her left hand, and searched with her right for the sword hidden behind his bed. As soon as he was asleep, she pulled it out, closed her eyes, and with one stroke, cut off the lion's head. But when she looked again, the lion had disappeared, and her dear brother stood beside her, kissing her warmly and saying, "You have freed me, because I was the lion, and was cursed to remain so until a maiden's hand, out of love for me, would cut off the lion's head." Then they went together into the garden to thank the frog. But when they arrived, they saw him hopping around in all directions, gathering small shavings and starting a fire. When it burned brightly, he hopped into it himself, and after it burned a little longer, The fire went out, leaving a beautiful maiden standing there, who had also been under a curse and was the prince's beloved. So they all went home together to the old king and queen, and a great wedding was held. Whoever was there did not go home hungry. The Soldier and the Carpenter. In a town there lived two carpenters whose houses were next to each other, and each had a son. The children were always together, played with each other, and were called Knife and Fork, because those were always laid together on the table. As they grew up, they did not want to be separated from each other. One was brave and the other fearful. Thus, one became a soldier and the other learned the trade of carpentry. When the time came for the carpenter's son to travel, the soldier did not want to leave him, and they set out together. They arrived in a city where the carpenter found work with a master craftsman, and the soldier also wanted to stay and hired himself out to the same master as a servant. This would have been fine, but the soldier had no inclination to work. He lay on the bearskin, and before long, the master sent him away. Out of loyalty, the diligent one did not want to leave him alone, so he also quit and they moved on together. This continued on. Whenever they found work, it did not last long because the soldier was lazy and would be dismissed, but the other would not stay without him. One time they came to a large city, but because the soldier did not want to lift a hand, he was dismissed in the evening, and they had to leave that same night. Their path led them to an unfamiliar large forest. The fearful one said, "I'm not going in. Witches and ghosts jump around in there." The soldier replied, "Bah! I'm not afraid of that yet," and went ahead, and the fearful one, because he did not want to leave him, went with him. In a short time, they lost their way and wandered through the trees in the darkness. Finally, they saw a light. They sought it out and came to a beautiful castle brightly illuminated. Outside lay a black dog, and on a pond nearby sat a red swan. But when they entered, they saw no one until they reached the kitchen, where a gray cat sat by a pot over the fire cooking. They continued and found many splendid rooms, all of them empty except one where a table was abundantly set with food and drink. Since they were very hungry, they began to eat and enjoyed themselves. Afterwards, the soldier said, "Once you've eaten and are full, you should go to sleep." He opened a chamber where there were two beautiful beds. They lay down, but just as they were about to fall asleep, it occurred to the fearful one that they had not yet prayed. He got up and saw a cupboard in the wall. He opened it and found a crucifix with two prayer books. He woke the soldier so that he had to get up, and they both knelt down and said their prayers. Then they slept peacefully. The next morning, the soldier received a violent shove that jolted him awake. "Hey, why are you hitting me?" he called to the other, who had also received a shove, and said, "I'm not shoving you. Why are you shoving me?" Then the soldier said, "It must be a sign that we should leave." When they came out, breakfast was already on the table, but the fearful one said, "Before we touch it, let's first look for a person." "Yes," said the soldier, "I always think the cat cooked and set it out. That takes away all my desire." So they went through the entire castle again, from top to bottom, but found no one. Finally, the soldier said, "Let's also go down to the cellar." When they descended the stairs, they saw an old woman sitting in front of the first cellar. They greeted her and said, "Good day. Did you cook the good meal for us?" "Yes, children. Did you enjoy it?" They went on and came to the second cellar, where a young man of 14 was sitting. They greeted him too, but he did not respond. Finally, they reached the third cellar, where a girl of 12 was sitting. She also did not reply to their greeting. They continued through all the cellars, but found no one else. When they returned, the girl had gotten up from her seat. They said to her, "Do you want to come upstairs with us?" She replied, "Is the red swan still on the pond?" "Yes, we saw it at the entrance." "That's sad. I can't come with you then." The young man had also gotten up, and when they approached him, they asked, "Do you want to come upstairs with us?" He replied, "Is the black dog still in the yard?" "Yes, we saw it at the entrance." "That's sad. I can't go with you either." When they came to the old woman, she had also risen. "Dear mother," they said, "do you want to come upstairs with us?" "Is the gray cat still in the kitchen?" "Yes, it's sitting by the hearth with a pot and cooking." "That's sad. Until you kill the red swan, the black dog, and the gray cat, we cannot leave the cellar." When the two companions returned to the kitchen, they wanted to stroke the cat, but it glared at them fiercely with fiery eyes. There was still a small chamber they had not visited. When they opened it, it was completely empty, except for a bow and arrow, a sword, and an iron pair of tongues hanging on the wall. Above the bow and arrow were the words, "This kills the red swan." Above the sword, "This cuts off the black dog's head." And above the tongs, "This pinches off the gray cat's head." "Oh," said the fearful one, "let's get out of here." But the soldier said, "No, let's find the animals." They took the weapons from the wall and went to the kitchen, where the three animals, the swan, the dog, and the cat, stood together as if they were up to something sinister. When the fearful one saw this, he ran away again. The soldier encouraged him, but he insisted on eating something first. After he had eaten, he said, "I saw armor in a room. I'll put on one of them first." When he was in the room, he tried to put it on but found it too heavy. The soldier said, "Come on, let's go as we are." "Yes," said the other, "if only there were three of us." As he said these words, a white dove fluttered to the window and pecked at it. The soldier opened the window, and when it flew in, there stood a handsome young man before them. He said, "I will be with you and help you," and took the bow and arrow. The fearful one told him he would be best with the bow and arrow. After the shot, he could go wherever he pleased, while they would confront the enchanted animals with their weapons. So the young man gave him the bow and arrow and took the sword. So all three went to the kitchen where the animals were still together. The young man cut off the black dog's head. The soldier grabbed the gray cat with the tongs, and the fearful one shot the red swan dead from behind. As the three animals fell, at that moment the old woman and her two children came running out of the cellar with loud cries. "You have killed my dearest friends! You are traitors!" They attacked them and tried to kill them, but the three overpowered them and killed them with their weapons. As soon as they were dead, a strange murmuring began all around and came from every corner of the castle. The fearful one said, "Let's bury the three bodies. They were Christians. We saw that from the crucifix." So they carried them out to the courtyard, dug 3 graves, and buried them. While they worked, the murmuring in the castle grew louder and louder, and when they finished, they distinctly heard voices inside, and someone shouted, "Where are they? Where are they?" When they realized the beautiful young man was no longer with them, they became afraid and ran away. After they had gone a little way, the soldier said, "It's not right that we ran away like that. Let's turn back and see what's there." "No," said the other. "I want nothing to do with these magic beings. I'll seek my honest living in the city." But the soldier wouldn't leave him alone until he went back with him. When they approached the castle, it was bustling with activity. Horses were galloping in the courtyard, and servants were running around. They pretended to be 2 poor craftsmen and asked for a little food. One of the crowd said, "Come in. Today good will be done to all." They were led to a beautiful room and given food and wine. Afterwards, they were asked if they had seen 2 young men from the castle. "No," they said, but when someone noticed blood on their hands, he asked where the blood came from. The soldier said, "I cut my finger." The servant reported this to the master, who came himself to see them. It turned out to be the beautiful young man who had helped them, and when he saw them, he exclaimed, "These are the ones who saved the castle." He welcomed them joyfully and explained what had happened. In the castle, there was a housekeeper with her 2 children who was a secret witch. Once she was scolded by the lord, she became malicious and turned everything that had life in the castle into stones. However, she had no real power over 3 other wicked servants who also practiced sorcery. She could only transform them into animals, which then wreaked havoc in the castle. She feared them and fled with her children to the cellar. She had only enough power over me to transform me into a white dove outside the castle. When you two entered the castle, you were supposed to kill the animals to set it free, and as a reward, she intended to kill you afterward. But God ordained otherwise. The castle is redeemed, and the stones turned back to life the moment the wicked witch and her children were killed. The murmuring you heard was the first words spoken by those who were freed. He then took the two companions to the master of the house, who had two beautiful daughters. They were given to them, and they lived happily ever after as great knights. Thus ends the tale of the soldier and the carpenter, who faced their fears, defeated evil, and found reward and happiness in the end. The Wild Man. Once upon a time, there was a wild man who was cursed and roamed among the farmers in the gardens and fields, causing trouble. The farmers complained to their landlord that they could no longer pay their rent. The landlord called together all the hunters and promised a great reward to anyone who could catch the creature causing these problems. An old hunter stepped forward, saying he would catch the wild man. They had to give him a bottle of brandy, a bottle of wine, and a bottle of beer, which he placed by the water where the wild man washed every day. He hid behind a tree. When the wild man came and drank from the bottles, it made him drunk and he fell asleep. The hunter then tied him up and woke him, saying, "You wild man, come with me. You won't drink like this every day." They took him to the noble castle and placed him in the courtyard. The lord invited neighbors to see what creature he had caught. One of the young lords played with a ball that fell into the courtyard, and the child said, "Wild man, throw the ball back to me." The wild man replied, "You must fetch it yourself." The child said he had no key. "Then go to your mother's room and steal her key," advised the wild man. The child opened the courtyard, and the wild man ran out. The child cried, "Oh, wild man, stay here, or I'll get a beating." The wild man lifted the child onto his shoulders and ran into the wilderness. The wild man dressed the child in shabby clothes and sent him to the emperor's court to ask if they needed a gardener's boy. The child arrived so dirty that others didn't want to sleep near him. He said he would sleep in the straw and went every morning to the garden where the wild man appeared, saying, "Now wash yourself. Now come here." The wild man made the garden so beautiful that even the gardener couldn't do better. Every morning, the princess saw the beautiful boy and asked the gardener's boy to bring her a bouquet of flowers. She asked what his status was, and he replied that he didn't know. She gave him a bag of sweets. Each time he brought back money, he gave it to his lord, saying, "What should I do with this? You need it more." Then she asked him to bring a bushel of flowers, giving him a bag of sweets. He did this again, bringing a goose full of sweets to his lords. The princess thought he had money and didn't. She secretly took him into her chambers, and her parents were angry, putting her to work spinning in the brewery. He worked in the kitchen, helping the cook turn bread and sometimes bringing meat to his wife. In England, a tremendous war broke out where the emperor had to go, along with all the great lords. The young man said he also wanted to go, asking if they had an extra horse in the stable. They replied they had one with 3 legs, which would be good enough for him. He mounted the horse, which went trotting along. Hoosapus, hoosapus. Suddenly, the wild man appeared before him, creating a huge mountain. There were thousands of regiments of soldiers and officers inside. He dressed in fine clothes and received a beautiful horse. He led all his people into the war in England. The emperor received him warmly and requested his assistance. He won the battle and defeated everything. The emperor thanked him profusely and asked what rank he held. The young man replied, "That's not something I can tell you." He rode back with his people from England. Again, the wild man appeared before him and led all his people back into the mountain. He mounted his 3-legged horse again. People said, "Here comes our hero again with his 3-legged horse." They asked him, "Where were you lying and sleeping behind the hedge?" "Oh," he said, "if I hadn't been there, things wouldn't have gone well in England." She said, "Quiet, my boy, otherwise the Lord won't give you anything to eat." And so it went 2 more times, and the 3rd time he conquered everything. He received a wound in his arm. The emperor took his cloth and bandaged his wounds. They urged him to stay. "No, I won't stay with you, and what I am, you won't understand." Then the wild man appeared again and led all the people back into the mountain and mounted his horse. They went home again. The people laughed and said, "Here comes our hero again. Where were you lying and sleeping?" He said, "I certainly wasn't sleeping. Now all of England is one, and there is true peace." Then the emperor spoke of the brave knight who had helped him. The young man said to the emperor, "If I hadn't been with you, things wouldn't have gone well. The emperor wanted to reward him. "Yes," he said, "if you don't believe it, I'll show you my arm." And when he showed his arm, and the emperor saw the wound, he was completely astonished and said, "Perhaps you are God himself or an angel sent by God, and ask for forgiveness for having treated you so harshly." And he gave him all his imperial possessions. And the wild man was redeemed, and stood there like a great king for him, and told him everything. And the mountain was an entire royal castle. He went there with his wife, and lived happily until their death. 57. The Children in Famine. Once upon a time, there was a woman with her 2 daughters who had fallen into such poverty that they didn't even have a bit of bread left to put in their mouths. When hunger grew so great among them that the mother became desperate and beside herself, she said to the eldest daughter, "I must kill you so that I can have something to eat." The daughter said, "Oh, dear mother, spare me. I will go out and try to get something to eat without begging." So she went out, returned, and brought back a piece of bread. They ate it together, but it was too little to satisfy their hunger. Therefore, the mother turned to the other daughter and said, "Now it's your turn." The daughter replied, "Oh, dear mother, spare me. I will go and quietly bring back something else to eat from somewhere else." So she went, returned, and brought back 2 pieces of bread. They ate them together, but it was still too little to satisfy their hunger. So after a few hours, the mother spoke to them again, saying, "You must die, for otherwise we will perish." In response, they said, "Dear mother, we will lie down and sleep, and not rise again until Judgment Day comes." So they lay down and fell into a deep sleep, from which no one could wake them. The mother, however, disappeared, and no one knows where she went. 66. The holy woman Kummernis. Once there was a pious maiden who vowed to God not to marry, and she was wonderfully beautiful, so much so that her father did not agree with her vow and wanted to force her into marriage. In this distress, she prayed to God that he would make a beard grow on her, which immediately happened. The king, however, became enraged and had her crucified, whereupon she became a saint. Now it so happened that a very poor minstrel came into the church where her image stood, knelt down before it, and the saint was pleased that he was the first to acknowledge her innocence. The image, adorned with golden slippers, caused one of them to loosen and fall down for the pilgrim's benefit. He gratefully bowed and accepted the gift. However, soon the gold slipper was missed from the church, and inquiries were made everywhere until it was finally found with the poor minstrel. He was condemned as a thief and taken away to be hanged. On the way, the procession passed by the shrine where the statue stood. The minstrel requested to enter so that he could bid farewell with his fiddle and pour out the troubles of his heart to his benefactor. This request was granted. But as soon as he played the first notes, behold, the image let the other golden slipper fall, thereby showing that he was innocent of theft. Thus the minstrel was freed from his chains and fetters, and he happily went his way. The holy maiden was called Kummernis. 175. Misfortune. When misfortune seeks someone out, they may try to hide from corner to corner or flee to the open field, yet it still manages to find them. Once there was a man who had become so poor that he had no firewood left to keep his hearth warm. He went out into the forest to cut down a tree, but they were all too large and strong. He ventured deeper until he found one he thought he could handle. Just as he lifted his axe, a pack of wolves burst out from the thicket, howling and advancing towards him. He dropped his axe, fled, and reached a bridge. However, the deep water had undermined the bridge, and at the moment he tried to step on it, it collapsed and fell apart. What could he do? If he stayed, awaiting the wolves, they would tear him apart. In desperation, he took a leap into the water, but unable to swim, he sank. A couple of fishermen sitting on the opposite shore saw the man fall into the water, swam over, and brought him to shore. They propped him against an old wall so he could warm up in the sun and regain his strength. However, as he woke from unconsciousness, wanting to thank the fishermen and tell them his tale, the wall collapsed on him and killed him. 182. The Pea Test. Once there was a king who had a single son who wished to marry, and he asked his father for a wife. "Your wish shall be fulfilled, my son," said the king, but it is fitting that you take no one but a princess, and there happens to be one nearby. However, I will announce it publicly. Perhaps one will come from afar." Thus, an open proclamation was made, and it didn't take long before enough princesses presented themselves. Nearly every day, a new one arrived, but when asked about their birth and lineage, it turned out none were princesses, and they had to depart empty-handed. "If this continues," said the prince, "I fear I will never find a wife." "Calm yourself, my dear," said the queen. "Before you know it, someone will appear. Fortune often knocks at the door. One just needs to open it." And indeed, it happened as the queen had said. Not long after, on a stormy evening with wind and rain lashing at the windows, there was a vigorous knocking at the gate of the royal palace. The servants opened it, and a stunning girl entered, demanding to be brought directly before the king. The king was surprised by the late visit and asked her where she came from, who she was, and what she desired. "I come from a distant land," she replied, "and I am the daughter of a powerful king. When news of your son's likeness reached my father's realm, I felt a deep love for him and set out immediately to become his bride." "This seems rather dubious to me," said the king, "and you do not look like a princess at all. Since when does a princess travel alone without any retinue and in such poor attire?" "The retinue would have only slowed me down," she answered. "The colors of my clothes faded in the sun, and the rain washed them out entirely. If you doubt that I am a princess, send a message to my father." "That would be too lengthy," said the king. "A delegation cannot travel as swiftly as you. People need the necessary time for that. Years would pass before they returned. If you cannot prove in another way that you are a princess, your wheat won't bloom here, and you should do better sooner than later to return home." "Let her stay," said the queen. "I will test her, and soon we will know if she is a princess." The queen herself climbed the tower and had a bed prepared in a magnificent chamber. When the mattress was brought, she placed 3 peas on it, one on the top, one in the middle, and one at the bottom. Then 6 soft mattresses were spread over them, linen sheets, and a comforter of eiderdown. Once everything was ready, she led the girl up to the bedroom. "After such a long journey, you must be tired, my child," she said. "Rest well. Tomorrow we will talk further." As soon as day broke, the queen ascended the tower to the chamber. She expected to find the girl still fast asleep, but she was awake. "How did you sleep, my dear?" she asked. "Terribly," answered the princess. "I didn't close my eyes all night." "Why, my child? Wasn't the bed comfortable?" "I have never in my life slept in such a bed. It was hard from head to toe, as if I were lying on a bunch of peas." "I see," said the queen. "You are indeed a true princess. I will send you royal attire, pearls, and gemstones. Adorn yourself as a bride. Today we shall celebrate the wedding."